Hey guys. Tonight we step into a place where the air itself feels like it remembers too much. Where stone has absorbed centuries of whispers. And where shadows seem to lean in as if they're curious about you. You're standing at the threshold of a medieval torture chamber. The kind of room that history textbooks mention in a single, nervous paragraph and then quickly move on from. Like someone changing the subject at dinner. The torchlight flickers. The walls sweat a little with cold. And somewhere in the distance you can hear a slow drip of water that sounds suspiciously like a metronome counting down something you'd rather not schedule. You take a breath and realize, with a small, dry laugh, that if you were actually here, you probably wouldn't last long. Honestly. You'd tap out before the guided tour even reached the second stop. You'd definitely not survive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, imagine leaving a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. Because somewhere in the world, it's always the middle of the night. And that feels strangely appropriate for this story. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step forward, and the door closes behind you with a sound that is less of a slam and more of a heavy, patient decision. The chamber is not large. But it doesn't need to be. Medieval builders understood that confinement does half the work on its own. The ceiling is low enough that you're aware of it, even if you don't quite have to duck. The walls are rough, uneven, and cold to the touch, like they were carved by people who were in no mood to be gentle. The floor is stone, worn smooth in places by centuries of feet, guards, officials, and those who arrived here under far less pleasant circumstances. A well-known historical reality is that such chambers were often part of castles, town halls, or inquisitorial complexes across medieval and early modern Europe. They weren't always hidden deep underground like in the movies. Sometimes they were just a few rooms away from where daily business was conducted. Which is unsettling in a very practical way. Imagine filing paperwork in one room and hearing distant echoes of questioning from the next. It's the medieval version of working in an open-plan office with extremely awkward acoustics. You notice iron rings set into the walls, spaced at intervals that suggest they were meant to hold something, or someone, steady. Wooden beams overhead bear the darkened marks of age and smoke, and perhaps of ropes that once rubbed against them. The light from the torches doesn't fully chase away the darkness, it only rearranges it, creating long, slow-moving shadows that seem to stretch and shrink as if breathing. A lesser-known detail is that many torture chambers were designed with sound in mind. Thick walls and heavy doors helped contain noise, not just for secrecy, but to maintain a kind of controlled environment. The goal was to make the space feel isolated from the world above. As if once you were inside, time and society had politely stepped outside for a moment. It's like being put on hold. But instead of elevator music, you get dripping water and your own thoughts. You become aware of the temperature. It's cool, even damp, and it seeps into your clothes and skin. In the medieval understanding of the body, cold and moisture were associated with certain imbalances of the humors, and discomfort itself was thought to make a person more open to confession. The environment wasn't just a backdrop, it was part of the method. The room was meant to wear you down gently before anything more direct was even considered. Think of it as psychological warm-up. Except it's cold, and no one brought snacks. A famous historical context for spaces like this is the use of judicial torture in parts of Europe under Roman canon law. Particularly from the 13th century onward, courts, including secular and ecclesiastical ones, allowed torture under specific legal conditions, usually when there was strong circumstantial evidence but not enough for a conviction. The idea, deeply flawed as it now seems, was that pain could help reveal the truth. It's a bit like assuming your computer will work better if you threaten it. Sometimes it might, but that doesn't make it a good long-term strategy. You stand still and listen. The chamber is not silent, but its sounds are minimal: the soft crackle of flame, the distant murmur of activity elsewhere in the building, the ever-present drip of water. Your own breathing sounds louder than you expect, as if the room is amplifying it. Paying close attention, there's a strange intimacy to that. Like the space is leaning in to hear your story before you've even had a chance to tell it. Historians still debate how frequently torture was actually used compared to how often it was merely threatened. Some argue that the reputation of these chambers did much of the work. That the fear of what could happen here was often enough to produce compliance without the full application of pain. Others point to records that show real, repeated use, carefully regulated by law and overseen by officials who believed, sincerely, that they were serving justice. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, shaped by time, place, and the particular people involved. You imagine, for a moment, the many individuals who once stood where you're standing now. Some were guilty of crimes. Some were not. Some were caught in political struggles, religious conflicts, or simple misfortune. Their experiences are not written on the walls in clear sentences. But the atmosphere carries a kind of residue. A sense that this room has hosted more intense emotions than most places ever will. Fear, defiance, resignation, hope, and sometimes, tragically, relief when it was over. A small, quietly humorous thought slips in. Because your mind is like that, if medieval chambers had visitor reviews, they would be very short and very negative. Cold, poor lighting, extremely stressful, would not recommend. 5 stars for historical authenticity. 0 stars for comfort. You take another slow breath. The chamber does not rush you. It has learned patience over centuries. It knows that anticipation can be as powerful as any device that might be stored just out of sight. The space itself is part of the story, part of the process, part of the reason why you, a modern visitor in imagination, can already feel a tightening in your chest just by standing here. And as you let your eyes adjust a little more to the dim light, you begin to notice the outlines of shapes along the walls and in the corners: benches, frames, hooks, objects whose purposes are not yet fully clear, but whose presence alone is enough to make your thoughts slow down and grow cautious. For now, though, nothing moves, nothing touches you. The chamber simply exists around you, holding its breath, waiting. And you, standing in the cool, shadowed stillness, become aware that the first challenge of surviving a medieval torture chamber might not be the pain itself, but the long, quiet moment before anything happens at all, when your imagination does all the work and the room lets it. The chamber does not exist in a legal vacuum. As unsettling as the cold stone and iron rings may feel, what truly gives the room its power is the invisible framework of rules, permissions, and procedures that hover over it like an unseen ceiling. This is not, in theory, a place of random cruelty. It is a place built to serve what medieval authorities believed was order. You begin to understand that in many parts of medieval Europe, torture was not supposed to be a first step. It was meant to come after suspicion, after testimony, after what the law called half-proof. The idea was that when evidence pointed strongly toward guilt but lacked a final, decisive confirmation, pain could supply what logic could not. It's a bit like deciding your internet connection isn't fast enough, so you try yelling at the router. The method is questionable, but the confidence is impressive. A well-known historical reality is that under Roman canon law, which influenced courts from Italy to parts of Germany and France, torture was formally regulated. Judges had to record why it was used, what questions were asked, and when it was stopped. In theory, it could not be repeated endlessly, and it was not to cause permanent injury. The word theory is doing a lot of heavy lifting here, of course. You imagine the legal documents, written in careful script, discussing procedures in calm, orderly language, while just a few rooms away the human consequences of those procedures waited in silence. The contrast is striking. Neat lines of ink on parchment on one side, rough stone and iron on the other. It's like reading a very polite instruction manual for something no one would ever want to assemble. A lesser-known detail is that many legal codes required a confession extracted under torture to be repeated later, without pain, to be considered valid. The logic was that only a freely spoken confession truly counted. This created a strange ritual, pain to obtain the words, and then a calmer setting to confirm them. One can't help but notice the circularity. After everything someone has just been through, how free that later confirmation really was is, at best, debatable. You feel the weight of this process in the air. The chamber is not just a room, it is part of a sequence. Before this moment, there would have been accusations, witnesses, perhaps rumors carried by neighbors or rivals. After this moment, there would be records, verdicts, and consequences that extended far beyond these walls. The space is a hinge, a place where stories are forced to bend in one direction or another. A famous historical context that illustrates this is the use of torture during certain inquisitorial proceedings in the later Middle Ages. Inquisitors, operating under both religious and legal authority, were allowed to use torture in limited circumstances to resolve cases of suspected heresy. The goal, at least officially, was not punishment but confession and reconciliation. The chamber thus became, in their eyes, a tool for saving souls as well as enforcing order. It's a deeply unsettling blend of spiritual concern and physical coercion, like insisting a very uncomfortable dentist visit is ultimately for your own good. You notice how the room seems arranged for formality as much as for fear. There is space where officials might stand, where a scribe could sit with parchment and ink, where questions could be asked in a measured tone. The setting suggests procedure, not chaos. Even the most intimidating objects appear placed with intention, not tossed aside. This is not a dungeon of random violence, it is, disturbingly, a workplace, A small, dry thought crosses your mind. Somewhere in medieval Europe, someone once had interrogation supervisor as their actual job title. And they probably complained about paperwork just like everyone else. Historians still debate how strictly these legal limits were followed in practice. Some records show careful adherence to rules, with torture applied briefly and stopped at the first sign of confession. Other sources suggest that in moments of political panic, religious fervor, or social unrest, the boundaries blurred, and the chamber's use became harsher and more frequent than the law technically allowed. The gap between regulation and reality is one of the most difficult parts of this history to measure. You become aware that the law itself shaped the emotional atmosphere of the room. This was not a place of wild rage, but of controlled pressure. The questions asked here were meant to follow a script, building step by step, tightening like a slowly turned screw. The process relied as much on anticipation as on action. Knowing that the law permitted what might happen was, in itself, a powerful force. Another lesser-known fact is that in some regions, the presence of torture chambers actually reduced the number of cases that went all the way to physical coercion. The threat, made credible by the existence of the room and its instruments, often produced confessions before the formal procedures even began. In that sense, the chamber functioned as a symbol as much as a site, a reminder of what the law could authorize if pushed. You look again at the iron rings in the wall and the heavy beams above. They are silent, inactive, yet full of implied motion. They are the punctuation marks at the end of a long legal sentence. The period that comes after, if necessary. A gently modern comparison floats through your thoughts. It's like seeing a warning sign on a high-voltage fence. You don't need to touch it to understand what it means. The understanding alone makes you step back. The chamber's authority, then, comes from more than fear of pain. It comes from the knowledge that society, law, and tradition have all agreed, at least for now, that what happens here is permissible. The stones are cold, the shadows are deep, but the most chilling element may be the quiet certainty that, in its own time, this place was considered legitimate. You stand there, breathing slowly, feeling the weight of that legitimacy press down like the low ceiling. It's one thing to imagine cruelty as chaos. It's another to realize how often, in history, it has been organized, scheduled, and justified with careful words and official seals. And as the torchlight flickers and the shadows shift, you sense that the chamber is not only a physical space but a legal one. Built at the intersection of fear and order, where the search for truth was once believed to require not only questions, but the full, chilling permission to make those questions hurt. Your eyes begin to adjust. And with that adjustment comes the slow recognition that the objects in this room are arranged almost like exhibits. Not hidden away in chests or shoved into corners, but positioned where they can be seen at a glance. The chamber is doing some of its work before a single question is asked. Letting shape and shadow speak first. A wooden frame leans against one wall, its joints reinforced with iron bands. Nearby, a collection of ropes is coiled with surprising neatness, like equipment in a well-organized workshop. Metal hooks catch the torchlight and throw back small, sharp reflections. None of these things are moving. None of them are touching you. And yet their presence feels active, as if they are participating in the conversation simply by being visible. A well-known historical reality is that medieval and early modern torture devices were often displayed intentionally. Interrogators understood that fear could be cultivated visually. Seeing the tools, even without understanding every detail of how they worked, could be enough to unsettle a person and make them more receptive to authority. It's the psychological equivalent of showing someone the dentist's drill before saying, "Now, this might sting a little." You notice that some instruments look almost abstract, more like odd pieces of furniture than anything else. Without context, you might mistake them for parts of a loom or a press. This ambiguity is unsettling in its own way. It reminds you that these objects were products of the same craft traditions that built bridges, doors, and carts. The skills of carpenters and blacksmiths, usually associated with protection and productivity, could be turned toward very different ends. A lesser-known detail is that many devices associated with torture had multiple ordinary uses in other settings. Pulleys, for example, were common in warehouses and shipyards. Ropes were everyday tools. Even frames and benches could resemble equipment used for labor or transport. In the chamber, these familiar forms took on a different meaning, transformed by context rather than by radical design. It's a bit like realizing that the same technology that makes elevators work can also be used to create a very unpleasant surprise. The arrangement of the room seems calculated to guide your gaze. Your eyes move from one object to another, tracing possible connections. Rope to beam, hook to ring, frame to floor. The space invites you to imagine sequences, to mentally rehearse what could happen. This, too, is part of the method. Anticipation, once sparked, is difficult to quiet. A famous historical context for this kind of visual intimidation comes from accounts of inquisitorial chambers in parts of Italy and Spain, where descriptions mentioned tools being kept in sight during questioning. The interrogator might speak calmly, almost gently, while the room itself provided a silent, persuasive counterpoint. The contrast between tone and setting could be disorienting, making the mind search for stability where none was offered. You feel that disorientation now. The chamber is still, the air is cool, the torchlight is steady. Nothing suggests immediate action, yet everything suggests potential. It's like standing in a kitchen where all the knives have been laid out on the counter, just in case. A small, wry thought surfaces. Medieval interior design clearly had a very different idea of what counts as motivational decor. Some instruments are more famous in legend than in actual widespread use, and historians have had to sort through later exaggerations to understand what was truly common. Certain devices that appear in museums today were sometimes reconstructed centuries later, based more on imagination than on surviving records. The line between historical reality and dramatic storytelling can blur, especially when fear is involved. Historians still debate how standardized these tools really were from one region to another, and how much local tradition and individual creativity shaped what appeared in a given chamber. Was there a common set of instruments recognized across Europe? Or did each place develop its own variations? The surviving evidence suggests a mixture of shared ideas and local adaptations, making each room slightly different in its silent vocabulary of threat. You sense that individuality here as well. The wear on a rope, the smoothness of a wooden surface, The way metal has been polished by repeated handling. All of it hints at specific hands. Specific moments. Specific stories. These are not abstract symbols. They are objects that have been used, maintained, and placed with intention. Another gentle, modern comparison slips into your thoughts. It's like walking into a gym and seeing all the equipment lined up, knowing you're about to be told, "We're starting with a light warm-up." The difference, of course, is that this is not about building strength, but about testing how much the human mind can carry before it asks for an exit. You stand quietly, letting the room show you its language. The tools are not speaking loudly. They don't need to. Their shapes, their materials, their careful placement do the work of suggestion, creating a mental landscape where possibilities feel heavier than certainties. And in that landscape, you begin to understand that survival in a medieval torture chamber would not depend only on what might be done to you, but on how well you could endure the long, slow pressure of being surrounded by objects that exist for a single, unsettling purpose, and that purpose, even when unspoken, is very hard to ignore. Your attention is drawn, almost magnetically, to the long wooden frame that dominates one side of the chamber. It lies low to the ground, built of thick beams polished smooth by time and handling, with rollers at either end and a system of ropes and pegs that looks, at first glance, almost mechanical in its calm precision. This is the device that later centuries would give a simple, chilling name: the rack. You don't need a demonstration to understand its basic idea. The logic is visible in its geometry. Two fixed points, a body positioned between them, tension applied gradually, not in a sudden shock, but in a controlled, measurable way. It is engineering in the service of pressure. The same principle used to tighten a bridge cable or stretch wet cloth. Redirected toward the human frame, the mind immediately fills in the rest, and your shoulders tighten in sympathetic imagination, as if they've just remembered an appointment they were hoping to cancel. A well-known historical reality is that versions of the rack were used in various parts of medieval and early modern Europe, particularly in judicial contexts where stretching the body was believed to encourage confession without necessarily causing visible injury at first. The emphasis, at least in theory, was on gradual increase: turn the handle, wait, ask the question, listen, then perhaps turn it again. It was less about spectacle and more about steady escalation. You notice the pegs along the side, spaced evenly, each one a possible stopping point. This suggests a process that could be paused, resumed, and carefully calibrated. The rack is not a wild instrument, it is a measured one. That, in its own quiet way, makes it more unsettling. It implies time, patience, and a belief that truth, like a stubborn knot, can be coaxed loose if you pull slowly enough. A lesser-known detail is that in some legal systems, the amount of stretching was meant to be limited by rules, sometimes even by physical markers on the device itself. The idea was to apply legal pain without causing permanent damage. A concept that now sounds like trying to define a safe speed for crashing into a wall. Yet the intention reveals how seriously procedure was taken. This was not supposed to be chaos, it was supposed to be controlled. You imagine the sound the mechanism might make, the soft creak of wood, the faint rasp of rope sliding over a roller, the quiet click as a peg is set into place. These are not loud, dramatic noises. They are the sounds of work being done, of a tool performing exactly as designed. In the stillness of the chamber, even such small sounds would feel amplified, each one a punctuation mark in a tense conversation. A famous historical context often associated with the rack is its use in certain high-profile political and religious trials in the late medieval and early modern periods. Accounts from England, for example, describe prisoners being put to the question on such devices in the Tower of London, where the aim was to extract information about plots and alliances. The rack, in these cases, became a symbol of state authority as much as of physical pressure, a reminder that the body itself could be drawn into the machinery of power. You step a little closer, careful not to touch, and notice how the frame is built low, keeping the person who would be placed upon it close to the ground. There is something humbling about that orientation. It denies any sense of height or dominance. You are not elevated, you are extended, aligned with the stone floor, as if the room itself is part of the process. A small, quietly nervous joke forms in your mind. This is one piece of furniture you definitely don't want to see in a flat-pack catalog. Assembly required. Consequences included. The medieval understanding of the body played into the logic of stretching. Bones, joints, and sinews were thought to have natural limits, and pain was seen as a signal that those limits were being challenged. The hope, from the interrogator's perspective, was that the mind would choose to speak before the body reached a breaking point. It was a grim negotiation, conducted in the language of leverage and restraint. Another lesser-known aspect is that the rack was sometimes used in stages, with questioning between each increase in tension. This created a rhythm: turn, ask, wait, turn, ask, wait. The process could be stopped and started, allowing the interrogator to observe reactions and decide how to proceed. It was, disturbingly, a form of feedback loop, where human response guided mechanical action. You feel how the design encourages anticipation. The device itself does not rush. It waits. It can hold tension indefinitely, like a drawn bow that refuses to release its arrow. The mind, placed in that waiting, has time to imagine what the next small movement might bring. In many ways, the pause is as heavy as the action. A gently modern comparison drifts through your thoughts. It's like watching a progress bar inch forward during a very important download. Except the stakes are unimaginably higher and there is no option to cancel. Historians still debate how consistently such devices were used according to the legal ideals described in manuals and how often practice diverged under the pressures of politics, fear, or urgency. Some records suggest careful adherence to procedure. Others hint at moments when limits were pushed or ignored. The rack, like the law itself, existed somewhere between rule and reality. You also become aware that the rack's reputation has grown over time, amplified by later stories, illustrations, and popular imagination. In some periods, it became the shorthand for all medieval cruelty. Even though many interrogations relied more on threat and psychological pressure than on the device itself. The symbol, in other words, may loom larger than its actual frequency of use. But symbols have a way of shaping memory more powerfully than statistics. You stand in the cool light, letting your eyes trace the straight lines and simple mechanics. There is no decoration here. No attempt to soften the impression. The design is functional, almost elegant in its clarity. It does exactly one thing, and it is very good at suggesting what that thing is. Another quiet, ironic thought appears. If medieval engineers had a motto, it might have been, efficient solutions for very specific problems, and this is a disturbingly literal example. The rack embodies a particular belief about truth, that it can be pulled out gradually, with enough force and enough time. It assumes that the body and the mind are linked in such a way that pressure on one will inevitably open the other. Whether that belief was justified is another question entirely, one that history has had centuries to consider. For now, you simply stand before the frame, feeling how its presence changes the air of the room. It is not moving, it is not in use, and yet it exerts a quiet gravity, a reminder that in this chamber, even stillness has a purpose. And even the simplest machine can carry a very heavy idea. Your gaze lifts from the low, stretching frame and follows the lines of rope upward, toward the dark beams in the ceiling. There, hanging quietly like a question mark made of hemp and iron, is another arrangement that relies less on complicated machinery and more on something very simple and very reliable: gravity. This is the logic behind what later generations would call the strappado. No wheels to turn, no long wooden bed to lie upon, just a rope, a pulley, and the unarguable pull of the earth. You can almost feel how it would work without anyone having to explain it. The body is lifted, suspended, and then, sometimes, allowed to drop a short distance before being caught again. Not a fall, not quite, but enough to make every joint suddenly very aware of its own existence. It's physics giving a stern lecture. A well-known historical reality is that the strappado, or forms very much like it, were used in various parts of medieval and early modern Europe, including in Italian city-states and in inquisitorial settings. It was considered effective precisely because it did not require large, permanent devices. A beam and a rope could be found almost anywhere. In other words, the architecture of the building itself became part of the method. Very efficient, in a deeply unsettling way. You notice how the ceiling here is reinforced. The beams thicker than strictly necessary for supporting a roof. A lesser-known detail is that in some chambers, these beams were intentionally strengthened or replaced to bear more weight, turning ordinary construction into something with a very specific secondary function. To a carpenter, it was just good engineering. To the person beneath it, it was a silent promise that the structure would not be the weak link. The rope hangs still, but your mind supplies motion. You imagine the slight creak as weight is taken, the soft groan of wood responding, the way the sound would travel through the chamber and settle into your ears. Unlike the rack, which suggests a slow, mechanical progression, this setup implies suddenness. Up, pause, perhaps a short drop, catch, pause again. The rhythm would be irregular, unpredictable, and that unpredictability would be its own kind of pressure. A famous historical context tied to this method appears in accounts of interrogations during the late medieval period in places like Venice and Florence, where records describe prisoners being hoisted during questioning. The emphasis in the documents is often on the sequence of questions rather than on the mechanics. But the presence of the pulley and rope is unmistakable. The city that mastered canals and cranes also understood how to apply those same principles indoors. In much darker circumstances, you can't help a small, nervous comparison. It's like an elevator that only goes up and down a few feet. And absolutely no one is enjoying the ride. Another quietly ironic thought follows. Gravity is one of the most reliable forces in the universe. And here it's being employed as a very committed assistant. A lesser-known fact is that in some legal codes, the strappado was considered a moderate form of torture because it could, in theory, be controlled and stopped quickly. The rope could be lowered. The person could be set back on the ground. No elaborate disassembly required. This classification tells you a lot about how pain was categorized and managed, and very little about how it was actually experienced. You also notice how little space this method needs. Unlike the rack, which demands a large footprint, the strappado could be performed in a corner, beneath a single beam. That portability made it practical in a wide range of settings, from formal chambers like this one to temporary holding rooms. The simplicity is part of what made it so widely known. Historians still debate how often such suspension methods were actually used compared to how often they were threatened, and how much their reputation alone contributed to confessions without the full procedure being carried out. The rope sways almost imperceptibly. Perhaps from a draft, perhaps from your imagination. It's enough to remind you that even a small movement in a space like this feels significant. The chamber amplifies, meaning the way a cathedral amplifies sound. You step back slightly, giving the hanging loop a respectful distance. The way one might give space to a very large, very calm animal. It isn't doing anything, but you're quite sure it could. And that seems reason enough to be polite. A third, lighter thought drifts in, because your brain insists on coping somehow. Medieval decor really leaned hard into the functional minimalism trend. One rope, one beam, infinite anxiety. The strappado represents a different philosophy from the rack, where the rack speaks of gradual, measured increase. This speaks of sudden dependence, of being entirely at the mercy of something that doesn't negotiate. It's the difference between a slowly tightening grip and the moment when your feet leave the ground. You let your eyes follow the rope up to the dark timber and then back down again, tracing the simple, unforgiving line it forms. The chamber remains quiet. Nothing is in motion, and yet, like the rack before it, this arrangement of wood, fiber, and empty air fills the room with possibility. You realize that surviving a place like this would not only be about enduring what actually happens, but about enduring the constant presence of what could happen, hanging there patiently, perfectly balanced, waiting for a signal to move. Your eyes drift from rope and beam to a darker corner of the chamber, where a low stone basin waits, half in shadow, its surface reflecting torchlight in a dull, wavering sheen. The water inside is still, but it looks heavy, the way cold water always does, as if it carries more weight than its volume should allow. The air around it feels a little cooler, a little damper, and you can almost smell the mineral tang that clings to old stone and standing moisture. This is where the logic of the cold water ordeal begins. Not blades, not stretching, not suspension, just the body's most basic reaction to sudden shock. Medieval justice sometimes blurred the line between torture and what were called trials by ordeal. Practices that were supposed to let God reveal the truth through physical tests. Water, fire, and iron became instruments not only of pain, but of judgment. A well-known historical reality is that various forms of water-based interrogation and ordeal were used across medieval Europe. In earlier centuries, the ordeal by cold water involved binding a suspect and lowering them into a body of water. Floating might be taken as a sign of guilt. Sinking as innocence, though rescue was supposed to come quickly. Later, in more judicial settings, controlled exposure to cold water, splashing, immersion, or forced drinking, was used to shock the body and break resistance. The transition from divine test to legal tool was gradual, and the two ideas overlapped in uncomfortable ways. You imagine the sensation, the way cold water steals breath. How the skin tightens instantly. How the mind, for a brief moment, forgets every prepared answer and focuses only on air and warmth. It's not dramatic in the way fire or iron might be, but it is profoundly disorienting. Your body would react before your thoughts could catch up. And in that gap between reflex and reason, words might spill out simply to make the shock stop. A lesser-known detail is that medieval physicians and interrogators were well aware of how cold affected the vital spirits. Sudden chill was thought to drive these spirits inward, toward the heart and brain, creating confusion, weakness, and an urgent desire for relief. In their framework, this made cold an effective, if risky, way to unsettle the balance of the body. It was physiology interpreted through humors and sensations rather than nerves and circulation. But the practical observations were keen. You notice how the basin is placed not in the center of the room, but close to a wall, as if meant to be approached deliberately. Nearby, there are hooks and rings at a height that suggests restraint. The design implies a sequence: hold, apply, pause, question. The water itself does not move, but it promises movement the moment a hand, a face, or a container meets its surface. A famous historical context for the lingering power of water in judicial thinking is the Church's earlier role in sanctioning ordeals. And then, in the 13th century, officially withdrawing its support for them, even after formal ordeals declined. The symbolic authority of elements like water and fire did not vanish. They were repurposed, stripped of overt theological framing, and folded into more rational, legal procedures. The tools remained, the explanations changed. A small, uneasy joke surfaces in your mind. Medieval spa treatments were clearly very different from modern ones. And the reviews would have been even worse. Historians still debate how frequently water was used in enclosed torture chambers compared to more mechanical methods, and how much of its reputation comes from earlier ordeal traditions and later early modern practices. Some records emphasize its role as a preliminary shock, others as a supplement to other techniques. What is clear is that water's power lay in its immediacy. You can resist pain for a while. You can brace for pressure. But the body's gasp for air when suddenly chilled is instinctive and hard to negotiate with. You step a little closer. Peering into the basin, the surface trembles slightly, perhaps from a vibration in the building, perhaps from your own movement. The reflection of the torch breaks into ripples. And for a moment the light looks fragmented, scattered. It's a quiet visual metaphor. Composure, like that reflection, can be disrupted very easily. Another gently modern comparison drifts in. Because your mind insists on finding one. It's like jumping into a cold pool when you were expecting a warm shower. The shock is brief, but in that brief moment, all plans and pretense evaporate. The cold water method represents yet another philosophy of pressure, where the rack stretches, and the strappado suspends. Water overwhelms. It doesn't pull or lift, it envelops. It fills the senses, dominates breathing, and leaves little room for anything else. It's less about force and more about interruption, cutting across the body's normal rhythms and replacing them with an urgent, singular demand. You straighten and step back, letting the stillness return to the basin's surface. The chamber remains quiet, but now you are acutely aware that even something as ordinary as water, which sustains life and cleanses, could be transformed here into a tool of fear and control. And you understand, with a soft, steady clarity, that surviving a medieval torture chamber would not only be about enduring pain, but about enduring shock, confusion, and the way familiar elements, wood, rope, stone, water, were reimagined as instruments in a system designed to leave no part of human experience entirely untouched. Your eyes settle on a small table near the wall, and for a moment you almost miss what rests upon it. After the long frames, the heavy beams, the ropes and basins, these objects seem modest, compact, almost delicate. Two small metal devices, each no larger than a clenched fist, sit side by side like tools borrowed from a craftsman's bench. Thumbscrews. They don't dominate the room the way the rack does. They don't reach up toward the ceiling like the rope and pulley. They simply wait at hand level, as if meant to be picked up and used with minimal effort. And that, in its own quiet way, is what makes them unsettling. The design is simple: 2 plates, a screw thread, a turning handle. The logic is immediately clear. Place something between the plates. Turn. The space becomes smaller. Pressure increases. No drama. No spectacle. Just a steady, narrowing world. A well-known historical reality is that thumbscrews and similar compression devices were used in various parts of medieval and early modern Europe, particularly in judicial and inquisitorial settings. They targeted small, sensitive parts of the body, thumbs, fingers, sometimes toes, areas dense with nerves and essential for daily function. The aim was not to overwhelm the entire body, but to create intense, localized discomfort that could be precisely controlled. You imagine how quiet the process would be. No creaking beams, no splashing water, no heavy mechanisms, just the soft, almost polite sound of metal threads turning. Click, click, click. It's the kind of noise you might hear while adjusting a clamp in a workshop. Except here the workpiece is very much alive and extremely aware of what's happening. A lesser-known detail is that these devices were often used early in an interrogation, sometimes even before larger methods were introduced. Their portability and simplicity made them convenient, and their psychological impact could be disproportionate to their size. The idea was to begin with something that looked manageable, almost trivial, and let the mind underestimate it. By the time the pressure became truly painful, the process was already underway, and retreat felt harder. You pick one up in imagination, feeling its weight. It's solid, well made, the threads smooth from repeated use. There is no decoration, no attempt to soften its purpose. It is a tool designed to do exactly one thing, and to do it reliably. In a different context, it might hold two pieces of wood together. Here, it holds attention, and then it holds nerves. A famous historical context for such small instruments appears in records of inquisitorial courts, where light torture was sometimes distinguished from severe methods. Thumbscrews, in legal language, could fall into the lighter category, used to encourage cooperation before escalating further. The classification tells you more about the legal system's need for categories than about the experience of the person on the receiving end. You notice how the devices fit easily in the hand of an interrogator. They don't require assistance, elaborate setup, or special space. One person, one question, one slow turn of a screw. The intimacy of that is striking. Unlike the rack, which involves distance and machinery, this method brings human hands close to human skin. The exchange is direct, almost personal. A small, uneasy joke flickers through your mind. It's like a handshake. Except no one is trying to make a good impression. The medieval understanding of pain included the idea that certain parts of the body were especially eloquent. Fingers, used for work, writing, and prayer, were thought to carry a kind of symbolic importance. Applying pressure there was not only physically effective, but psychologically resonant. It threatened the very tools by which a person acted in the world. Another lesser-known observation from period sources is that compression devices were sometimes preferred because they left fewer obvious marks. Bruising might fade, swelling might go down, in a legal culture that, at least in theory, tried to avoid permanent injury. This made such tools attractive. The absence of visible damage, however, did not mean the absence of intense sensation in the moment. Historians still debate how often these devices were actually used compared to how often they were simply displayed and described. Some argue that their reputation alone, passed along in stories and whispered warnings, made them powerful deterrents. Others point to court records that list them among standard equipment, suggesting they were very much part of the practical repertoire. You turn your attention to the table itself. It's at a comfortable working height, as if designed for careful, repeated tasks. The interrogator could stand there, adjust the device, ask a question in a steady voice, and wait. The setting implies patience. This is not about a sudden burst of force, but about sustained, focused pressure applied in small increments. Another gently modern comparison surfaces. It's like adjusting the volume knob on a radio. Except the station you're tuning into is, please, make it stop. The psychological effect of such methods lay in their precision, because the pressure could be increased so gradually. There was time to think between each turn of the screw, time to anticipate the next movement, time to wonder how much worse it could get. The mind, given this space, often raced ahead of the body, imagining outcomes that had not yet occurred and reacting to those imaginings with real fear. You can see how this fits into the broader pattern of the chamber. The rack stretches, the strappado lifts, the water shocks, the thumbscrews whisper. They don't shout, they don't announce themselves with spectacle. They communicate through closeness and control, through the steady narrowing of space and the quiet certainty that the turning can continue. A well-known historical event that underscores the variety of such tools is the careful cataloging of interrogation equipment in some early modern prisons and castles. Inventories list not only large frames and ropes, but also small clamps, screws, and irons, all recorded with the same bureaucratic calm as tables and chairs. The mundane tone of these lists contrasts sharply with the intense reactions those objects could produce. What's less often mentioned is how interchangeable these items could be with everyday tools. A screw press, a clamp, a vise, familiar objects in workshops, could be adapted with minimal modification. The boundary between craftsmanship and coercion was, in material terms, surprisingly thin. You set the imagined device back on the table and step away, letting the torchlight catch on its metal surface one last time. It glints briefly, then settles into a dull shine, as if it has no interest in drawing attention to itself. It doesn't need to. Its effectiveness lies in understatement. Another soft, ironic thought drifts by. In a room full of dramatic contraptions, the smallest tool might be the one that gets the most done. The chamber remains quiet. No screws are turning. No hands are reaching for the table. Yet the presence of these small, precise instruments adds another layer to your understanding. Survival here would not only be about enduring grand, theatrical ordeals, it would also be about enduring the intimate, methodical pressure of tools designed to work slowly, persistently, and with an almost unsettling calm. You breathe in the cool air and let it out again, aware that in this space, even the faintest sound, a metal thread turning, a soft click, could carry enormous weight. And you realize that in a medieval torture chamber, silence itself can be just as articulate as any scream, especially when it is punctuated by the quiet, patient whisper of a screw being turned. Your eyes are drawn next to a corner where the light seems warmer, not brighter, just tinged with a faint amber hue. There is no open flame licking at stone, no roaring furnace, but there is a metal brazier, dark with age, and nearby, a collection of iron implements resting on hooks, rods, plates, and tongs whose shapes suggest they were meant to be heated, even if they are cold now. This is the realm of fire without flames, the threat of heat more than its full release. A well-known historical reality is that in many medieval and early modern interrogations, the mere presence of heated tools could be enough to produce compliance. Interrogators did not always need to apply burning directly. The sight of iron glowing, the smell of metal warming, the faint hiss when something hot met damp air, these sensory cues alone could convince the mind that resistance was about to become extremely uncomfortable. You imagine how the temperature in this corner would change when the brazier was active. The subtle shift in air, the way warmth would press against the skin, the way shadows would flicker more quickly as flames moved. Heat announces itself long before it touches you. It fills the space, makes the room feel smaller, more urgent, as if there is less and less neutral ground left. A lesser-known detail is that medieval legal and medical texts sometimes distinguished between actual burning and threatened burning. The former could cause permanent injury and was, in theory, restricted. The latter, holding heated iron close enough to be felt, to be smelled, to be heard, was considered a way to apply pressure without crossing certain legal boundaries. Again, Theory and practice did not always align. But the distinction shows how carefully the experience of fear itself was categorized. You notice that some of the iron tools have flattened ends. Others narrow points. In a workshop, these might be used for shaping metal or leather. Here, their shapes take on a different implication. They are not meant to cut or pierce, but to radiate, to threaten contact, to make the skin imagine a future it very much wants to avoid. A famous historical context for this kind of intimidation appears in records from various inquisitorial courts, where the fire is mentioned not always as an applied method, but as something prepared, demonstrated, and brought close. The language is often vague, shown the instruments, brought near the heat, suggesting that the anticipation itself was considered part of the process. A small, dry thought crosses your mind. Medieval central heating had a very aggressive customer service policy. The psychological logic is clear. Heat is universal. Everyone knows what it feels like to touch something too hot. You don't need a detailed explanation. The body carries that memory already, stored in nerves and instinct. When warmth intensifies beyond comfort, the imagination fills in the rest with remarkable speed. Another lesser-known observation is that interrogators sometimes combined heat with other methods, using warmth to heighten sensitivity. Skin that is warm can feel pressure, cold, or touch more intensely. In this way, fire did not always stand alone. It prepared the body, made it more reactive, more aware, more eager for any change that would bring relief. Historians still debate how often actual burning was used in formal judicial torture compared to how often it was invoked as a threat. Popular imagery tends to emphasize flames and glowing irons, but many records suggest that the controlled display of heat was more common than full application. Fear, again, often did the work more efficiently than injury. You step a little closer to the cold brazier and look inside. Ash, long settled, forms a soft gray layer at the bottom. It is quiet now, harmless in appearance, but it carries the memory of fire, just as the chamber carries the memory of voices. Both are absent, yet their traces remain. A gently modern comparison slips in. It's like standing near a stove that's been turned off, still warm enough to remind you what it could do if someone decided to turn the knob again. The iron tools hang motionless, but they seem to lean forward slightly in the torchlight, as if curious. Their weight, their density, their ability to hold and radiate heat make them patient. They can wait a long time and still perform exactly as expected when the moment comes. In the overall language of the chamber, these objects add another tone. Not the steady pull of the rack, not the sudden lift of the rope, not the shock of cold water or the whisper of the screw. This is the slow, enveloping promise of warmth turning into something much less gentle. You breathe in and notice that the air here is no different, really, from anywhere else in the room, and yet your body reacts as if it might be. Muscles tighten slightly. The skin becomes more aware of its own surface. The mind runs ahead, imagining gradients of temperature, points of contact, the thin line between tolerable and too much. Survival in a medieval torture chamber, you realize, would depend not only on enduring what is done, but on enduring what is suggested. Heat, even when absent, can dominate a space. It can make silence feel like a countdown and stillness feel like a held breath. The brazier stays dark. The irons remain cool. But the idea of fire, once introduced, lingers like an afterimage on the eyes. Proof that in this room, even warmth can be turned into a language of warning. And even light can carry the quiet message that comfort and danger are sometimes separated by nothing more than a single, deliberate spark. Near the center of the chamber, where the torchlight gathers in a dull pool, sits a heavy chair made almost entirely of iron. It does not look dramatic. No spikes, no blades, no obvious moving parts. It looks, at first glance, like something you might find in a very unfriendly waiting room. Thick legs, a high back, wide armrests, and a seat that offers no softness at all. This is the iron chair, and its power lies not in sudden violence, but in stillness. You imagine being guided toward it, the way one is guided toward any ordinary chair. A hand indicating where to sit. A voice suggesting cooperation. The body, trained by habit, wants to comply. Chairs are for resting, for support, for pauses. But this one is built to do the opposite of what a chair usually does. It is meant to hold you in place until the act of sitting itself becomes the strain. A well-known historical reality is that various forms of restraint chairs were used in medieval and early modern detention and interrogation. They appear in records from city prisons and inquisitorial settings, often described simply as the chair or the seat, as if understatement could make the purpose sound more reasonable. The goal was immobilization, forcing the body into a fixed posture for long periods, sometimes combined with bindings at the wrists, ankles, and chest. You study the armrests. They are broad, with metal rings bolted into their sides. The back has similar fittings. The legs of the chair are anchored to the stone floor, not movable, as if the builders wanted to be absolutely certain that this piece of furniture would never wander off, no matter how persuasive its occupant might be. A lesser-known detail from surviving descriptions is that some of these chairs were designed with subtle angles, slightly tilted seats, rigid backs that did not follow the natural curve of the spine. The result was a posture that looked upright and controlled, but that slowly became exhausting. Muscles that usually shift and relax were forced into constant work, holding the body steady against unyielding metal. It's like being asked to sit perfectly straight on a hard bench for hours. Except the bench does not allow you to adjust, and the clock does not seem to move. You imagine the first few minutes, uncomfortable, but manageable. The next half hour, the small adjustments you instinctively try to make, only to find that straps and rings limit how far you can shift. An hour passes. The body begins to ache in places you don't usually notice. The base of the spine, the backs of the thighs, the shoulders where they meet the neck. None of this is dramatic. There is no single moment of sharp pain. There is only accumulation. A famous historical context for such restraint appears in accounts of prison discipline in late medieval cities, where the chair was used not only during interrogation but also as punishment in itself. Being fixed in place, visible to guards, unable to lie down or move freely, was a way of enforcing obedience through controlled discomfort. It was, in effect, a lesson in how long the body could be made to wait. A quiet, slightly ironic thought crosses your mind. This is one chair that truly commits to the concept of no lounging. The iron is cold, even if the room itself is not freezing. Metal draws warmth from the skin. You would feel that immediately. A steady seep of heat from your back, your arms, your legs, into the chair. Medieval medicine associated cold with stiffness and contraction. And in that sense, the material choice was not accidental. The chair does not just hold you. It slowly persuades your muscles to tighten and tire. Another lesser-known observation from period writings is that prolonged immobilization was believed to make the body more pliable to suggestion. When circulation slowed and sensation dulled in some areas while sharpening in others, the mind could become foggy, irritable, or strangely detached. The chair, in this view, was not merely a restraint but a way of preparing the body for questioning, softening resistance through fatigue rather than through immediate pain. You notice how the chair is positioned facing an open area of the room. It is not tucked into a corner. It is placed where someone sitting in it would be clearly visible. Framed by stone and light, the arrangement suggests an audience, an interrogator standing in front, perhaps a scribe nearby, parchment on a small desk, recording every word. The person in the chair would be both the focus of attention and completely unable to move away from it. A well-known historical event that echoes this use of immobilization is the formalization of interrogation procedures in late medieval and early modern courts, where the sequence of questioning, restraint, and record-keeping became increasingly standardized. The body, fixed in a chair, became part of a process that treated stillness as a condition for truth, as if motion itself were suspicious. Historians still debate how often such chairs were used purely as a preliminary measure and how often they became, in practice, a form of torture in their own right. Was the intention mainly to hold, or to exhaust, to prevent movement, or to create discomfort that would make the mind more willing to comply? The sources suggest that, as with many things in this chamber, the line between preparation and punishment was thin and often crossed. You imagine the soundscape from this seat, the faint crackle of torches, the drip of water you heard earlier, the quiet rustle of parchment as a quill moves. These ordinary sounds would take on a new weight when you cannot shift position. When every minute is marked by the same unchanging posture, time, in such a situation, would feel less like a flow and more like a series of small, evenly spaced weights being placed, one by one, on your shoulders. Another gently modern comparison floats through your mind. It's like being stuck in the world's most uncomfortable airplane seat. Except there is no in-flight movie and no one is offering drinks. The iron chair represents a different strategy from the devices you've already seen. The rack and the strappado rely on motion, stretching, lifting, dropping. The water shocks. The screws compress. The heat threatens. The chair, by contrast, does almost nothing. It simply refuses to let you do anything either. It turns inactivity into an active force. You step closer and place your hand, in imagination, on the armrest. The metal is smooth, worn by contact, slightly rounded at the edges. This is not a crude, jagged object. It is finished, crafted, meant for repeated use. The craftsmanship itself is unsettling, because it suggests planning, expectation, and routine. A small, dry joke surfaces, as your mind insists on finding one. Medieval furniture designers really knew how to commit to a theme. The chair's simplicity is its strength. It does not rely on spectacle or sudden shock. It relies on patience, on the slow dialogue between muscle and gravity, on the way the body, when denied movement, begins to argue with itself, sending signals of discomfort that grow louder over time. In the quiet of the chamber, the iron chair waits. It does not need to be adjusted. It does not need to be prepared. It is always ready, always the same, always offering the same promise: sit and stay. And you understand that surviving a medieval torture chamber would not only be about enduring moments of intense sensation. It would also be about enduring the long, heavy stillness, the kind that creeps into joints and thoughts alike, and whispers, with steady persistence, that sometimes the hardest thing to bear is not what happens, but what is made to continue happening without change. You begin to notice something that isn't an object at all, yet feels as present as the rack, the rope, or the iron chair. Sound. And its deliberate absence. The chamber is not silent, but it is carefully quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing, of the faint swallow in your throat, of the tiny movements your body makes even when you think you are still. Somewhere, water continues its slow, patient dripping. Torch flames murmur softly, a low, irregular whisper. Stone contracts and expands with the night's temperature, producing occasional clicks that sound, in this space, far more intentional than they really are. You realize that in a medieval torture chamber, sound was never neutral. It was either controlled, manipulated, or strategically removed. A well-known historical reality is that interrogations were often conducted in rooms built with thick walls and heavy doors. Not only to prevent escape, but to contain noise. These chambers were meant to separate the world of questioning from the everyday sounds of life outside. Markets, bells, laughter, carts on cobblestones, all of that was filtered out, leaving only the acoustics of confinement. The person inside was meant to feel cut off, as if the rest of the city had been placed on mute. You listen again. The drip becomes louder the longer you focus on it. It is steady, patient, impossible to ignore once noticed. Each drop lands with a tiny, echoing tap, like a clock that refuses to show its face but insists on counting anyway. Time becomes audible. A lesser-known detail from some prison accounts is that guards and interrogators were aware of how repetitive sound could wear on the mind. Dripping water, the creak of a rope shifting slightly, the rhythmic pacing of boots in a corridor, none of these were violent in themselves. But over long periods, they could fray attention and amplify anxiety. The brain, deprived of variety, begins to magnify whatever remains. You imagine sitting in the iron chair, unable to shift, listening to that same drop, over and over. At first it's background, then it becomes a companion, then it becomes an intrusion. Eventually, it becomes the only thing your thoughts can orbit, like a small planet with too much gravity. A famous historical context for the use of controlled sound and silence appears in descriptions of monastic prisons and inquisitorial complexes, where architecture was designed to dampen echoes and isolate rooms acoustically. The same building techniques that created peaceful cloisters for contemplation could also create chambers where isolation was intensified, and where the absence of familiar noise made the mind turn inward with uncomfortable force. You also notice how voices would behave here. The low ceiling and stone walls would catch and reflect them, softening edges, blending words together. An interrogator could speak calmly, almost gently, and yet the sound would fill the room completely, leaving no corner untouched. There would be nowhere for a voice to fade into insignificance. A small, uneasy thought drifts through you. This room has perfect acoustics for bad news. Silence, too, has a texture. Between questions, there might be long pauses. Not empty pauses, but heavy ones, loaded with the awareness of what might come next. The mind, left alone in that gap, supplies its own images. It replays what it has seen: the rack, the rope, the screws, the brazier, the chair. Each second of quiet becomes an invitation to imagine movement. A lesser-known observation from period writings is that some interrogators deliberately used silence as part of their method. After a question, they would wait, not rush, not fill the space with words. They understood that people often speak to break quiet, to relieve the pressure of waiting. Even before any physical action is taken, the room itself, in its stillness, becomes a participant. Historians still debate how systematically such psychological techniques were taught and whether they were formalized or simply learned through experience. Passed from one official to another as practical wisdom. Was silence an intentional tool? Or did its effects emerge naturally from the architecture and procedure? The records hint at both. You become aware of your own internal noise now. The soft thud of your heartbeat in your ears. The faint rush of blood when you shift your weight. The whisper of fabric against skin. In a place like this, the body's sounds can feel amplified, as if the chamber is listening back. Another gently modern comparison floats through your mind. It's like being in a recording studio where every tiny sound is picked up by the microphone. And you suddenly realize you've never been so loud just by existing. The contrast between noise and silence is carefully balanced. A sudden sound, a door opening, a chain moving, a tool being set down, would cut through the quiet like a blade through cloth. The startle response would be immediate. Physical. Heart rate quickens. Muscles tense. Attention snaps to the source. Even before anything happens, the body is already preparing. This is the environment in which questions are asked. Not shouted. Not necessarily. Sometimes spoken in an even, conversational tone, made more unsettling by the way it carries in the still air. The room ensures that every word arrives clearly and stays, echoing slightly, as if the stone itself is repeating it. You imagine the sound of a rope being pulled through a pulley. The faint rasp of metal threads turning on a screw. The soft clink of iron against iron when a tool is lifted from a hook. None of these are loud. But in this space, they would be impossible to ignore. Each one would signal a change in the situation. A shift from waiting to action. From possibility to reality. A well-known historical event that underscores the importance of controlled environments is the development of purpose-built interrogation rooms in late medieval and early modern judicial complexes, where architecture, lighting, and acoustics were all considered part of procedure. These were not accidental spaces. They were designed to focus attention, limit distraction, and heighten the psychological weight of the moment. You stand quietly and let the chamber's soundscape wash over you. The drip, the flame, the distant murmur beyond thick walls. The soft, steady presence of your own breathing. And you realize that survival here would not only depend on enduring what might be done to the body, but on enduring the long stretches where nothing happens, where the only pressure comes from time, from anticipation, from the way silence gives your imagination too much room to work. In this chamber, sound is a tool, silence is a tool, and both, used carefully, can be as persuasive, as unsettling, and as powerful as any machine built of wood and iron. Your thoughts drift from the careful acoustics to the way this chamber is hidden, yet not entirely. You begin to sense the contrast between places meant to be seen and places meant to be concealed, and how medieval justice balanced both. Some torture chambers were buried deep beneath castles, monasteries, or town halls, reachable only by narrow stairways and heavy doors. Others, however, were positioned closer to public spaces, sometimes even adjacent to courtrooms or prisons where the movement of guards and officials could be heard. The message was clear. What happened here was secret in detail, but not in existence. Fear worked best when people knew such rooms were real, even if they never saw inside. A well-known historical reality is that in many medieval cities, the presence of a torture chamber was an open secret. Citizens might not know its exact layout, but they knew it was there. The knowledge functioned as a warning, a reminder that the law had teeth. Public punishments in squares and marketplaces were one side of this system. The hidden chamber was the other. The quiet place where compliance could be shaped before any sentence was carried out. You imagine standing in a busy medieval street, hearing bells, vendors calling, children running, and knowing that just a few walls away, beneath your feet or behind a thick stone door, there was a room like this one. The contrast is unsettling, everyday life continuing above, routine and noisy, while below, questions were being asked in low voices, in rooms where sound was carefully contained. A lesser-known detail is that some chambers were deliberately located so that muffled noises could, on rare occasions, be heard in nearby corridors or courtyards. Not clearly, not enough to identify words, but enough to suggest activity. This was not necessarily an accident. A hint of sound could reinforce the reality of authority without revealing its methods. It was the medieval equivalent of letting the audience hear the opening notes of a song before the curtain rises. You think about how architecture becomes part of communication. Thick walls for privacy, narrow doors for control, staircases that turn sharply, disorienting anyone led down them. Even the distance from the surface world to this room would matter. Each step a small separation from daylight and from the ordinary rhythms of life. A famous historical context for this blend of secrecy and visibility is the layout of certain inquisitorial complexes in Spain and Italy, where interrogation rooms were built within larger administrative buildings. Officials moved between offices, archives, and chambers as part of a single workflow. The process of questioning was integrated into governance, not hidden away in some forgotten ruin. Power, in these places, did not need to hide completely, it only needed to manage what was seen. A quiet, slightly ironic thought crosses your mind. Medieval city planning really committed to the idea of mixed-use spaces, just with a much darker zoning category. The public nature of justice also meant that rumors traveled. People spoke of what happened in the chamber, even if they had never been inside. Stories grew, details blurred, and the reputation of the place often became larger than its day-to-day reality. Fear, once released into a community, did not require precise information to remain effective. Historians still debate how much of the terror associated with torture chambers came from actual frequency of use and how much from their symbolic role in maintaining order. Were these rooms constantly active, or did their power lie more in the knowledge that they could be used? The surviving records suggest periods of intense activity and long stretches of quiet. A rhythm shaped by politics, religious conflict, and local unrest. You consider how different it feels to imagine a completely hidden dungeon versus a chamber that exists as part of a known institution. In one, cruelty seems chaotic and lawless. In the other, it is framed as procedure, as something that belongs to the same world as seals, documents, and official robes. The latter may be more unsettling, because it suggests that what happens here is not an exception, but an extension. Another gently modern comparison surfaces. It's like knowing there's a strict principal's office in your school. You might never be sent there, but just knowing it exists changes how you behave in the hallway. The chamber you stand in now carries both identities. It is physically enclosed, acoustically isolated, and visually hidden, yet it is also part of a larger, visible system of authority. Its door may be closed, but its purpose is not a mystery to those who live under the law it serves. You feel that duality in the air. This room is a secret, but it is a well-known one. It is meant to be out of sight, but never out of mind. And that, you realize, is part of why survival here would be so difficult. You would not only be confronting the tools and the procedures. You would be confronting the weight of a whole society's expectations, pressing in from above, from the streets, from the courts, from the voices that say this place exists for a reason. The stone walls hold you in, but beyond them lies a world that has agreed, at least for now, that this chamber has a role to play. And in that agreement, quiet and unspoken, you can feel the true measure of its power. Your thoughts move from the architecture and its messages to the people who worked here. The ones who learned how to use this space as carefully as a craftsman learns to use tools. The interrogator was not, in most cases, an improviser. He was trained. You imagine him entering the chamber with a measured pace. Not hurried, not theatrical. His role was not to lose control, but to apply it. Medieval legal culture valued procedure. And that extended even into rooms like this. Questions were prepared, sequences were planned, pressure was meant to increase gradually, not explode all at once. It was, in a grim way, a kind of curriculum. A well-known historical reality is that in many European regions, officials responsible for interrogation received formal instruction in legal theory and practice. They studied what constituted sufficient evidence, when torture could be authorized, how it was to be recorded, and when it was supposed to stop. Manuals circulated, outlining step-by-step processes, much like handbooks for any other specialized profession. The chamber was not just a place, it was part of a system that prided itself on order. You picture a training room far from here, perhaps in a university or a legal court, where future judges and notaries learned about the question, as torture was often euphemistically called. They would read case summaries, discuss precedents, and debate how to interpret signs of truth or deception. All of it in clean air, under daylight, with ink and parchment, long before anyone ever set foot in a room like this. A lesser-known detail is that some interrogation manuals advised starting with conversation, then moving to threats, and only later to physical methods, always watching the subject's reactions. The goal was to observe not just words, but tone, hesitation, and changes in demeanor. Pain, in this framework, was one variable among many, to be introduced only after others had been tested. It was, disturbingly, a kind of behavioral science in its early form. You sense how this training would shape the atmosphere here. The interrogator would not rush. He would ask, pause, listen, perhaps rephrase. He would know when to remain silent and when to speak. He would be taught that impatience could ruin a confession, that too much force too quickly might break the body before the mind yielded anything coherent. Efficiency, not rage, was the ideal. A famous historical context that reflects this professionalization is the establishment of permanent inquisitorial offices in the 13th and 14th centuries. Complete with records, archives, and standardized procedures, interrogation became something that could be taught, supervised, and evaluated, not merely improvised in moments of crisis. The chamber thus became a classroom's distant, darker counterpart, where theory met its most severe application. A small, uneasy thought crosses your mind. Somewhere, someone once earned a reputation for being very good at this. And that reputation probably came with promotions. The presence of a scribe reinforces the sense of method. Every question, every answer, every pause could be noted. The written record mattered, sometimes as much as the spoken words. It created a feedback loop. The interrogator acted, the scribe recorded, the judge reviewed, and the process refined itself over time. The room was not only a stage, but a data-gathering site. Historians still debate how consistently this ideal of controlled, trained procedure was followed in practice, and how often personal temperament, local politics, or simple fatigue overrode the manuals. Some accounts suggest careful adherence to rules. Others reveal moments when frustration or fear led to harsher, less measured actions. The tension between training and reality runs through the surviving sources like a faint but persistent crack. You imagine the interrogator glancing at the tools, not with curiosity, but with familiarity. He knows what each one does, how long it takes to set up, what reactions it usually produces. He has seen patterns: who resists, who breaks quickly, who grows silent. This knowledge, accumulated over years, would shape the way he looks at you, not as a mystery, but as another case to be worked through. Another gently modern comparison surfaces. It's like a technician approaching a complex machine. Not with emotion, but with a checklist. The training also included limits. At least in theory. Manuals warned against causing death or permanent injury. Not out of compassion alone, but because a dead or irreparably damaged subject could no longer testify. The goal was information, confession, resolution. The body was a means to an end, and that end required it to remain, in some sense, functional. You feel how chilling that practicality is. The room is not governed by impulse. It is governed by routine, by the expectation that what happens here follows patterns that have been learned. refined, and passed on. As you stand in the quiet, you realize that survival in a medieval torture chamber would not only depend on your own endurance. It would depend on the training of the person asking the questions, on how strictly he followed his instructions, on where you fell within his mental categories of risk and resistance. The stone, the tools, the silence, all of it is held together by human judgment shaped through education and tradition. And that, perhaps, is one of the most unsettling truths of all. This room is not the product of chaos, but of lessons learned, written down, and taught, generation after generation, with the calm confidence of a system that believed it knew exactly what it was doing. You notice another presence in the chamber that is easy to overlook at first. A small table with clean cloths, a bowl, and instruments that look more suited to a sickroom than to a courtroom. A knife for cutting bandages. A small container that might hold salve. Perhaps even a cup for water or wine. This is the quiet corner where medicine meets procedure. It feels strange to think of a physician here. Yet a well-known historical reality is that doctors were sometimes present, or at least on call, during judicial torture. Their role was not to heal in the modern sense, but to monitor, to ensure the subject did not die too quickly, to judge when the body was reaching a point where it could no longer continue without serious risk. The goal, from the system's perspective, was not destruction, but endurance, just enough to keep the process going. You imagine a physician standing slightly apart, observing breathing, skin color, the way the chest rises and falls. He listens for changes, watches for faintness, notes when trembling turns to dangerous weakness. In his training, these signs mean one thing in a hospital bed and something very different here. The same knowledge of the body is applied, but with an inverted purpose. A lesser-known detail is that some medical texts from the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance discuss how pain, fear, and exhaustion affect the vital spirits, and how these in turn influence consciousness and speech. Physicians were thought capable of advising when a person was near collapse, or when a pause might restore enough strength for questioning to continue. It's a careful, unsettling balance, preserving life not for its own sake, but to extend a procedure. A famous historical context for this uneasy partnership appears in records from certain inquisitorial courts, where doctors were explicitly instructed to be present to prevent fatal outcomes during torture. Their testimony could later be used to show that proper care had been taken. That limits, at least as defined by the law of the time, had not been exceeded. Medicine, law, and coercion intersected in the same room, each claiming its own kind of authority. You glance again at the cloths and bowls and think, with a quiet, ironic edge, that this is one of the few places in history where having a doctor nearby did not automatically mean you were about to feel better. The physician's presence would change the rhythm of the chamber. Interrogation might pause while he checked a pulse or dabbed sweat from a forehead. These small, almost gentle actions could be profoundly confusing to the mind. Care and threat, relief and anticipation, woven together so closely that it would be hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Historians still debate how often such medical supervision truly limited harm and how often it simply provided a professional seal of approval for practices that were already severe. Did the physician's watchful eye genuinely protect life? Or did it mainly reassure authorities that the process could continue without immediate catastrophe? The surviving documents offer glimpses, but not complete answers. You imagine the doctor's quiet instructions, a nod to proceed, a raised hand to stop, a murmur about breathing or color. In this setting, those gestures would carry enormous weight. A small movement of his fingers could mean the difference between another question and a pause. Between continuation and reprieve. A gently modern comparison drifts through your thoughts. It's like a very tense sports match where the medic stands by the sidelines, ready to decide if the player can go back in or must be taken out, except here. The game is something no one would ever want to win. The presence of medical oversight also reinforces how institutional this space is. This is not a chaotic scene of uncontrolled violence. It is a procedure with multiple roles: interrogator, scribe, guard, physician. Each has a function, a script, a responsibility. The body at the center of it all becomes, in a way, the shared project they are all managing. You feel the weight of that organization. The tools are arranged, the chair is fixed, the ropes are ready, the basin is filled, and in the corner, the cloths and instruments wait, prepared to respond not to suffering itself, but to its limits. As you stand in the cool, dim air, you realize that surviving a medieval torture chamber would not only depend on your own strength or resilience. It would also depend on the calculations of those watching, on how they interpreted signs of weakness or stability, on when they chose to pause and when to continue. The physician's quiet presence adds another layer to the room's atmosphere. It suggests that even here, where fear and pressure dominate, the body is being carefully observed, measured, and managed, not out of compassion in the way we understand it today, but out of a desire to keep the process within bounds that the law, and the people who served it, had decided were acceptable. And in that careful, clinical attention, you sense one more reason why survival would be so difficult. Because this chamber is not only a place of force, but a place of calculation, where even care itself can become part of the machinery that keeps everything going. As the chamber's routines and roles become clearer, another consequence quietly takes shape in your thoughts. The words spoken here are not always the same as the truth. Pain, fear, exhaustion, and isolation do not simply loosen tongues, they reshape stories. A well-known historical reality is that torture often produced confessions that were later shown to be false or wildly exaggerated. In medieval and early modern courts, people sometimes admitted to crimes they had not committed, to conspiracies that never existed, or to details that matched what interrogators already suspected rather than what had actually happened. The body, under pressure, learns quickly that certain answers bring pauses, while others bring continuation. The mind begins to navigate toward whatever seems most likely to stop the process. You imagine being asked the same question again and again, phrased slightly differently each time. At first you answer honestly. Then the silence stretches. A tool shifts. The tone changes. Just a little. You start to notice patterns. When you say one thing, nothing happens. When you say another, there is movement, attention, perhaps even a brief relief. The room teaches you, quietly, which words have weight. A lesser-known detail from surviving trial records is that some interrogators would suggest specific scenarios during questioning. Not as accusations, but as possibilities. Could it have been this way? Might you have met this person? Over time, these suggestions could become woven into a confession, not because they were remembered, but because they were repeatedly presented as options. The line between recalling and agreeing grew thin. A famous historical context for this problem appears in the large wave of witch trials in late medieval and early modern Europe. Under torture or the threat of it, accused individuals sometimes described elaborate gatherings, supernatural journeys, and named accomplices, creating chains of accusation that expanded from a single case into dozens. The confessions fit the expectations of the authorities and the fears of the time. But their factual accuracy remains deeply questionable. You sense how the chamber encourages narrative. It is not only a place of answers, but of story-making. The scribe waits with quill poised. The interrogator asks for sequence, motive, detail. The law prefers a coherent account, something that can be written down, reviewed, and judged. The mind, under strain, tries to provide that coherence, even if it means assembling it from fragments, guesses, and what it believes the room wants to hear. A small, uneasy joke drifts through you. It's like being in a very strict improv class where the rule is always, yes. And, except the consequences of getting the scene wrong are considerably worse. Another lesser-known observation from period writings is that once a confession had been given under pressure, it often shaped all later questioning. The initial story became a framework, and new questions were designed to fill in its gaps rather than to challenge its foundation. In this way, an early, coerced statement could guide an entire investigation, reinforcing itself simply by being written first. Historians still debate how many medieval confessions reflect genuine admissions and how many were constructed, consciously or unconsciously, in response to the expectations of interrogators and the atmosphere of the chamber. Some cases show later retractions or contradictions, others remain ambiguous, preserved only in the official record that Payne helped produce. You imagine the strange moment when questioning stops and the subject is asked to repeat the confession without torture. As some legal systems required, the words are the same, but the context is different. Are they now freely chosen, or merely rehearsed? The body remembers what followed the first version, and that memory does not vanish just because the room has grown quieter. Another softly modern comparison surfaces. It's like agreeing to the terms and conditions of something you barely had time to read, just to make the pop-up go away, and then being told later that you chose them willingly. In this chamber, truth and survival can pull in slightly different directions. The system seeks information, but the body seeks relief. Where those goals overlap, a confession may be accurate. Where they diverge, the words may drift toward whatever seems most likely to end the moment. You feel how heavy that realization is. The tools, the training, the medical oversight, all of it is designed to manage the body and the process. But the mind, under such management, may become less a mirror of events and more a navigator, steering toward the nearest safe harbor it can imagine, even if that harbor is built of borrowed or invented details. As the torchlight flickers and the chamber remains still, you understand that surviving here would not only mean enduring sensation, it would mean enduring the pressure to shape your own story under conditions that reward certain versions of it and discourage others. And in that shaping, In that careful, coerced crafting of narrative, you can sense one of the most lasting consequences of this place. Not just the strain on the body, but the way it can bend memory, language, and the very idea of what it means to say, "This is what really happened." Your thoughts move from the fragile nature of confessions to the way certain names and cases echo through history, carrying the weight of what happened in rooms like this. Some trials became famous not only because of their outcomes, but because they revealed, in stark detail, how the machinery of interrogation and torture could shape entire narratives. A well-known historical reality is that high-profile political and religious trials in the late Middle Ages and early modern period often relied on evidence extracted under pressure. Accusations of treason, heresy, or conspiracy were not just legal matters, they were matters of state security and spiritual order. When the stakes were that high, the chamber's role became central. It was here that uncertainty was forced into clarity, or at least into something that looked like clarity on parchment. You imagine one such case: a prisoner brought in under guard, suspected of plotting against a ruler or of holding forbidden beliefs. The questions are careful at first, circling, probing, names are mentioned, places, meetings that may or may not have happened. Each answer is weighed not only for its content, but for how it fits into a larger political picture. The chamber, in these moments, becomes less about an individual and more about a network, a web of possible connections the authorities are trying to map. A famous historical context is the use of torture during certain state trials in places like late medieval France, the Holy Roman Empire, and Tudor England. Prisoners accused of participating in rebellions or conspiracies were put to the question to extract information about accomplices and plans. The resulting confessions, sometimes detailed and dramatic, entered official chronicles and shaped how entire events were later understood. A lesser-known detail is that in some of these cases, the sequence of questioning reveals how stories evolved. Early statements might be vague, cautious. Later ones, after increased pressure, become more elaborate, naming more people, describing more meetings, filling in gaps with growing confidence. To later readers, these expanded confessions can look like the gradual uncovering of truth. To modern historians, they often look like the gradual construction of a narrative under constraint. You sense how powerful such documents would be. Once written, sealed, and archived, they take on an authority of their own. Future officials read them, chroniclers summarized them. Generations later, students encounter them as sources, sometimes without fully feeling the conditions under which the words were first spoken. A quiet, uneasy comparison forms. It's like reading a movie script and forgetting that the actors were being directed, coached, and sometimes pushed to deliver their lines in a certain way. Another well-known example comes from the trials associated with religious dissent, where confessions obtained under torture described beliefs, rituals, and secret gatherings. These accounts often aligned neatly with what authorities already feared or expected. Whether they reflected real practices, misunderstandings, or stories shaped by suggestion and desperation remains a subject of intense scholarly debate. Historians still argue over how much weight to give such famous cases. Some see them as windows, however distorted, into hidden worlds of belief and resistance. Others view them primarily as mirrors of official anxiety, reflecting more about the interrogator's questions than about the accused's actual lives. The chamber sits at the center of that debate, an unseen collaborator in the making of the record. You imagine the moment when a confession is read aloud in court. The words, once spoken in a low voice in this dim room, now carry across a hall. They sound firm, resolved, almost confident. The audience hears them without hearing the drip of water, the creak of rope, the soft turning of a screw. The context has changed, but the text remains, stripped of the sensations that shaped it. Another softly modern thought passes through you. It's like watching a polished interview clip on the news and forgetting all the off-camera pressure that went into producing those few calm sentences. The famous cases remind you that what happens in a torture chamber does not stay there. It travels outward, into law, into politics, into history books. It influences reputations, decisions, even the course of events. A single coerced statement can ripple through time, affecting how an entire episode is remembered. As you stand in the imagined stillness of this room, you feel the weight of that legacy. The chamber is not just a place of immediate fear and control. It is a place where stories are forged under conditions that make them powerful and problematic at the same time. And you understand that surviving such a space would not only mean leaving it alive, but living with the knowledge that the words spoken here might follow you, shaping how you are seen and understood long after the door has closed behind you. Your thoughts shift to another layer of this place, one that is easy to overlook when the mind focuses only on mechanisms and law. Not every person who passed through rooms like this fit the same expectations. And not every body was treated the same way. Gender, in the medieval world, shaped assumptions long before any question was asked. You imagine how the chamber might feel if you were here not as an abstract suspect, but as a woman in a society that already carried strong ideas about weakness, temptation, and moral vulnerability. The tools would be the same. The stone just as cold. The ropes just as patient. But the story built around you, the meaning assigned to your presence, would often be different. A well-known historical reality is that women were subjected to judicial torture in medieval and early modern Europe, particularly in cases involving accusations of heresy, witchcraft, or moral crimes. The later witch trials are the most famous example. But even before that period, women accused of religious dissent or of threatening social order could be brought into chambers like this one and questioned under pressure. You sense how the interrogator's training and expectations would intersect with cultural beliefs. Medieval medical theory often described women as more moist, more cold, more emotionally changeable, and therefore, in some views, more susceptible to both spiritual influence and physical weakness. These ideas did not stay in medical books. They shaped how authorities interpreted hesitation, tears, or silence. What might be read as stubbornness in a man could be read as deceit or instability in a woman. And the response could follow accordingly. A lesser-known detail from legal records is that in some regions, there were formal discussions about how and whether certain methods should be applied to women. Concerns were sometimes raised about modesty, about physical harm, about the presence of male officials. Yet these concerns rarely led to exemption. More often, they led to procedural adjustments, the presence of female attendants, different forms of restraint, or modified positions. The pressure remained, only its presentation changed. You imagine being led into the room, aware not only of the tools, but of the eyes upon you, of the unspoken judgments about what your body and mind were believed to be capable of enduring. The iron chair would still be cold. The rope would still hang from the beam. The basin of water would still wait in its corner. But the narrative surrounding you would be layered with ideas about morality, sexuality, obedience, and danger. A famous historical context that brings this into sharp focus is the later wave of witch trials in parts of Germany, France, and Switzerland, where women formed a large proportion of the accused. Interrogations in those cases often sought not only confessions of specific acts, but stories of seduction, secret meetings, and spiritual corruption. The chamber became a place where cultural fears about women's supposed closeness to the supernatural were given physical form through questioning and pressure. You feel how the earlier discussions about false confessions and suggestion take on a particular weight here. When an interrogator already believes that a certain kind of story is likely, of secret gatherings, of forbidden knowledge, of hidden influence, the questions can guide the answers with quiet persistence. The subject, trying to survive the moment, may begin to mirror those expectations, shaping her words to fit the patterns that the room seems to reward. A softly uneasy thought crosses your mind. It's like being cast in a role you never auditioned for, and then being judged on how convincingly you play it. Another lesser-known observation from some trial records is that women sometimes attempted to resist not only through silence, but through appeals to social roles, motherhood, widowhood, illness, age. These were ways of invoking identities that the law and society recognized as deserving of some protection. Whether such appeals succeeded depended greatly on the local context, the officials involved, and the wider atmosphere of fear or stability. Historians still debate how much gender influenced the actual application of torture versus how much it influenced the interpretation of what was said under torture. Did women experience fundamentally different methods? Or did they experience the same methods filtered through different expectations? The sources suggest both continuity and difference, making it difficult to draw a simple conclusion. You imagine the physician's role again, observing signs of weakness or endurance, and how those signs might be read differently depending on who displayed them. A faintness in one body might be taken as a medical warning. In another, it might be seen as confirmation of fragility, or even of guilt. The same physical response could be given different meanings by a system already primed to see certain patterns. The presence of a scribe, too, would matter. The way he chose to record tears, pauses, or emotional outbursts could shape the official story. A trembling hand might be described as fear, or as deception, or as the natural reaction of a weaker constitution. Once written, those descriptions would harden into part of the case, influencing how judges and later readers understood what had happened. A gently modern comparison drifts through your thoughts. It's like reading a transcript that notes voice quivering, without ever telling you whether that quiver came from cold, exhaustion, or something much deeper. You realize that for women in the chamber, survival was not only about enduring the tools and procedures. It was also about navigating a dense web of assumptions about character, morality, and vulnerability. Every reaction could be interpreted through those lenses. And once interpreted, it could be used to justify the next step. The chamber, then, was not a neutral space. It was a stage on which broader social ideas played out in intensely personal ways. The stone walls and iron devices were the same for everyone. But the stories built around the bodies within them were shaped by who those bodies were believed to be. As you stand in the imagined stillness, you feel how heavy that realization is. The struggle here was never purely physical. It was also interpretive. To survive, one would have to endure not only pressure and pain, but the meanings imposed upon one's responses. The narratives that the room, the law, and society were ready to construct. And you sense that in a medieval torture chamber, the question was never only, "What did you do?" It was also, quietly and persistently, "What kind of person are we prepared to believe you are?" Your thoughts, already heavy with the weight of law, belief, and expectation, drift to an even more unsettling possibility: that not everyone who passed through spaces like this was an adult fully entangled in politics or theology. In rare but documented cases, the very young were drawn into the machinery of interrogation. A well-known historical reality is that medieval legal systems did recognize age as a factor in responsibility. And children were often treated differently in courts. There were limits, at least in theory, on what could be demanded of them and how harshly they could be questioned. Yet those limits were not absolute. In times of panic, during outbreaks of alleged heresy, conspiracy, or later, witchcraft, young people sometimes became witnesses, informants, and, in a few tragic cases, suspects themselves. You imagine the chamber from a smaller height. The iron chair now seems enormous. The ropes and rings are far above eye level. The shadows stretch longer, the torchlight more confusing. A child's sense of scale would make everything here feel even more overwhelming. The room itself a kind of giant, silent presence. A lesser-known detail from certain trial records is that children were sometimes questioned not because authorities believed them to be the main offenders, but because they were thought to be easily influenced, easily frightened, and therefore more likely to speak. Their words could then be used to support accusations against adults, parents, neighbors, teachers. The chamber, in these moments, became a place where fear moved not only through bodies, but through families and communities. You think about how a young mind would process the routines you've already imagined, the formal questions, the long pauses, the presence of tools, the way adults in authority watched closely for every reaction. Even without physical coercion, the psychological pressure would be immense. Silence would feel longer. Voices would sound deeper. The room would seem to demand answers simply by existing. A famous historical context that casts a long shadow here is the later witch trials, particularly in parts of Germany and Switzerland, where children's testimonies sometimes played a role in identifying supposed gatherings and naming participants. While the peak of these events lies slightly after the medieval period, they grew out of legal and cultural practices already in place. The idea that a young person's fear-filled account could be shaped into formal evidence was not entirely new. Another lesser-known observation is that when children were involved, authorities sometimes framed their questioning as an act of protection rather than coercion. They claimed to be rescuing young souls from corruption. or to be uncovering dangers that threatened the innocent. This language of care could coexist uneasily with methods that were deeply intimidating. It is another example of how the system could interpret its own actions in reassuring terms, even when the experience itself was anything but reassuring. You imagine a guard trying to be gentle, a physician watching more closely than usual, an interrogator lowering his voice. These adjustments might have existed, yet the chamber itself would not change. The cold stone would still chill. The shadows would still loom. The silence would still press in. For a child, the contrast between supposed mercy and the reality of the space could be deeply confusing. Historians still debate how frequently minors were subjected to direct physical torture in medieval courts and how often they were primarily exposed to psychological pressure and threatening environments. The records are uneven, and the language used to describe age and responsibility shifts from region to region. What is clear is that when young people were drawn into such proceedings, the experience could leave lasting marks, whether or not the tools were ever fully employed. A quietly modern comparison drifts through your mind. It's like being called into a principal's office as a child. Except the office is built of stone, the authority absolute, and the consequences far beyond detention. You sense how the very concept of mercy becomes complicated here. Medieval law did contain ideas about leniency, about reduced culpability, about protection of the young. But those ideas existed alongside powerful fears of spiritual danger, of social disorder, of hidden threats that might justify extraordinary measures. When fear dominated, the boundaries of mercy could shrink. Standing in the imagined chamber, you feel the weight of that tension. Survival here would be difficult for anyone. For someone young, with limited understanding of law, of accusation, of the roles being played around them. It would be even more bewildering. The room would not explain itself. It would only wait. And you realize that one of the most haunting aspects of spaces like this is not only what was done, but who could be brought within their walls. The chamber was built for adults, for authority, for procedure, yet in moments of collective anxiety, its shadow could reach far beyond its intended scope, touching lives that were barely beginning. In that realization, the stone seems colder, the silence heavier, not because new tools have appeared, but because you now sense how wide the circle of vulnerability could become when fear, law, and belief converged in a single, unyielding room. Your thoughts drift from law and age to something even older and more powerful in shaping what happened here: belief. Not just personal faith, but organized, articulated, and preached belief, ideas about sin, salvation, and the condition of the soul that wrapped themselves around the chamber like an invisible second set of walls. A well-known historical reality is that in medieval Europe, suffering could be framed as spiritually meaningful. Pain was not always seen as pointless. It could be interpreted as purifying, as a test, or even as a way to bring hidden truth into the light. In religious courts, especially those dealing with suspected heresy, torture was sometimes justified as a means of saving a soul, not merely punishing a body. The logic was that error endangered eternity, and temporary suffering might be a lesser price than everlasting loss. You imagine an interrogator who truly believes this. His voice is calm, even earnest. He speaks of repentance, of confession, of reconciliation with the Church. The tools are present, but the language is pastoral. It's a strange mixture. The tone of a sermon paired with the setting of a dungeon. Comfort and threat woven into the same sentences. A famous historical context for this is the medieval Inquisition, particularly from the 13th century onward, when church authorities sought to identify and correct what they saw as dangerous deviations in belief. Torture, though regulated and theoretically limited, was permitted in certain circumstances to obtain confessions. The official aim was not execution, but repentance and return to orthodoxy. The chamber, in this view, became a place of forced spiritual clarity. A lesser-known detail is that some theological writers argued that physical pain could awaken the soul, shaking it out of stubborn error. They compared it, in metaphor, to cauterizing a wound or setting a broken bone, unpleasant, but intended to heal. The comparison is telling, and a little chilling. It frames coercion as a kind of medicine, with the interrogator cast, in part, as a healer of belief. You sense how this language would change the atmosphere. The questions are no longer only about facts, who met whom, where, and when. They are about intention, about inner conviction, about what you truly believe when all defenses are stripped away. The chamber becomes, in theory, a place where the soul is examined as carefully as the body is restrained. A small, quietly ironic thought surfaces. It's like a very intense confession booth, with significantly worse seating. Historians still debate how sincerely these religious justifications were held by those who carried out interrogations and how often they served to reassure consciences already committed to a process for political or social reasons. Did officials truly see themselves as rescuers of souls? Or did the language of salvation simply provide a comforting framework for actions driven by fear of disorder and dissent? The sources show both conviction and convenience, sometimes in the same breath. You imagine a prayer being said before questioning begins. Perhaps a request for guidance, for truth, for the strength to do what is necessary. In such moments, the chamber would feel less like a purely legal space and more like a ritual one. The tools, the silence, the sequence of actions, all could take on a liturgical rhythm, as if part of a dark ceremony whose goal was alignment of belief. Another lesser-known observation from inquisitorial records is that some confessions were followed by acts of penance rather than immediate punishment, pilgrimages, prayers, wearing of symbols. This reinforces the idea that the process was framed, at least officially, as corrective. The chamber was a doorway, in theory, to reintegration as much as to condemnation. A gently modern comparison drifts through your mind. It's like being told, "This is for your own good," in a tone that suggests disagreement is not an option. You feel how this spiritual framing could deepen the psychological pressure. If the pain is presented not only as legal but as morally necessary, resistance becomes more complicated. To endure is not just to oppose authority, but, in the story being told, to oppose what is claimed to be divine order itself. The weight of that claim can be heavier than iron. The scribe's quill moves, recording words that may later be read as signs of repentance or stubbornness. The physician watches the body. The interrogator watches the face. And over it all hangs the language of salvation, quietly insisting that what happens here has meaning beyond the immediate moment. You realize that survival in a medieval torture chamber would not only be about withstanding physical and psychological pressure. It would also be about navigating a world where that pressure could be clothed in sacred purpose. Where suffering might be presented as a step toward grace. And where the line between coercion and care for the soul was drawn by those who held all the power. The stone walls remain the same. The tools do not change. But the story told about them does. And in that story, pain is not only an instrument of the law. It is, in some eyes, an instrument of God. Your thoughts move from faith to power, from salvation to sovereignty, and you begin to sense how this chamber could also serve a purpose that was entirely worldly. Beyond questions of doctrine and conscience, there was the quiet, persistent need of rulers to secure their position, to map loyalty, and to make uncertainty visible. A well-known historical reality is that political prisoners, suspected rebels, courtiers accused of intrigue, envoys thought to be double agents, were sometimes brought into rooms like this to clarify what the state most feared: hidden networks. The goal was not only confession of a single act, but the drawing of a wider picture. Who met whom, where, under what pretext? The chamber became a place where the state tried to turn rumor into record. You imagine the tone shifting slightly. The questions are no longer about abstract belief or personal sin, but about roots, letters, seals, and whispered promises. Maps might be unrolled, names spoken softly, as if volume itself could wake sleeping alliances. The tools remain in the background, visible enough to remind you that cooperation has a physical horizon. A famous historical context for this is the use of judicial torture in late medieval and early modern treason investigations, such as those surrounding court conspiracies and regional revolts. In these cases, confessions were prized not only for admitting guilt, but for naming accomplices. One statement could set off a chain of arrests, each leading back to this room, each adding another thread to the web the authorities were trying to untangle. A lesser-known detail from some state archives is that interrogators sometimes focused on mundane logistics, where a horse was stabled, how long a messenger took, which tavern a meeting used, because these details could be cross-checked. Pain might produce a story, but consistency across small, ordinary facts was what officials looked for when deciding how seriously to take it. It's the unglamorous side of intrigue, the inventory list of a conspiracy. You sense how the atmosphere would feel more strategic than moral. The interrogator is not seeking repentance so much as confirmation. The scribe notes distances and dates. The physician watches for signs of collapse, not out of kindness, but to keep the flow of information possible. The room becomes a kind of human map room, where bodies replace parchment and answers replace ink. A softly ironic thought slips in. It's like being asked to provide your entire contact list. Except the stakes are considerably higher and the customer support is not friendly. Another layer of pressure emerges here, the fear of consequence beyond yourself. In political cases, a word spoken in this chamber could reach far beyond the stone walls, touching families, patrons, and allies. The choice between silence and speech was no longer only about personal endurance, but about the fate of others whose names might surface with the next question. Historians still debate how reliable such politically charged confessions were, especially when they named multiple accomplices under duress. Were these networks real, exaggerated, or partially constructed from expectation and fear? The records show both genuine plots uncovered and cascades of accusation that later unraveled, leaving behind a trail of lives disrupted by words formed under pressure. You imagine the pause after a name is spoken. The quill hesitates, then scratches across parchment. A guard shifts his weight. The interrogator's eyes narrow, not in anger, but in calculation. One answer opens the door to 10 more questions. The chamber, in this moment, feels less like a place of judgment and more like a node in a larger system. A relay point where information is extracted and passed along. A gently modern comparison surfaces. It's like a very high-stakes background check, where every detail is cross-referenced. And the interview room has a distinctly medieval approach to follow-up questions. The tools in the room, rack, rope, screws, water, heat, chair, remain silent witnesses. Their presence underscores the seriousness of the exchange. They do not need to be used to influence the direction of the conversation. The knowledge that they could be used is often enough to keep the flow of names and places moving. You realize that in political cases, survival was tangled with strategy. To speak might mean temporary relief and long-term consequences. To remain silent might mean immediate pressure and uncertain outcomes. The chamber forced decisions in a landscape where every path seemed to narrow. As the torchlight flickers and the stone holds its cool, you feel how this room served not only courts and churches, but crowns and councils. It was a place where the state listened closely, where loyalty and threat were weighed, and where the human voice, under careful pressure, became one of the tools by which power tried to make the hidden visible. Your mind drifts to the rare stories that move in the opposite direction of all this pressure. The moments when someone did not endure the full sequence. When the chamber's door closed behind them sooner than expected. Not because of confession or collapse, but because of influence. A well-known historical reality is that in medieval and early modern judicial systems, wealth, status, and connections could sometimes bend procedure. Bribes, favors, and the quiet intervention of powerful patrons did not officially exist, of course. On parchment, the law was firm and impartial. In practice, however, the world of courts and councils was woven from relationships. A well-placed word could delay an interrogation. A generous gift could soften a guard's memory. A letter bearing an important seal could reroute a case entirely. You imagine the chamber on a day when something like that happens. The tools are ready. The scribe has ink. The interrogator has his questions. And then a messenger arrives. Breath slightly quickened, carrying instructions that change the rhythm of the room. Perhaps the questioning is postponed. Perhaps the subject is transferred. Perhaps, quietly, the matter is said to be under review. A lesser-known detail from some legal archives is the existence of recorded payments for custody expenses, or administrative fees, that, when compared across cases, seem unusually high in moments when prisoners were released or treated with unexpected leniency. The language is polite and bureaucratic, but the timing can be suggestive. It hints at a gray zone where procedure and persuasion overlapped. You think about how hope would feel in such a space. Not the steady, moral kind, but the fragile, calculating kind that looks for cracks in the system. A whispered rumor that someone influential is aware of your situation. A guard who suddenly avoids eye contact but lingers near your door. The faint sense that events are moving, just not in the direction the chamber usually dictates. A famous historical context for this is the role of patronage in medieval justice. Nobles, church officials, and wealthy merchants could sometimes intercede on behalf of clients or relatives. Their intervention did not always mean innocence, it meant leverage. The law could be slow, but influence could be quick. A small, quietly ironic thought surfaces. It's like discovering there's a VIP exit from a very unpleasant venue. And the bouncer recognizes your name. Escape, too, enters your thoughts, though more is legend than routine. The architecture you've already considered, the thick walls, the heavy doors, the controlled sound, was designed precisely to make leaving difficult. Yet stories circulate of prisoners slipping restraints, of sympathetic guards, of doors left unlatched in moments of chaos. They are rare, but they persist, passed along in the same whispering way as all tales of improbable survival. Historians still debate how many such escapes and quiet releases actually occurred and how many grew in the telling. Shaped by the human need to believe that even the most controlled systems have gaps. The records, being official, naturally emphasize procedure over exception. The stories, being human, cling to exception as proof that fate is not entirely mechanical. You imagine the tension of such a moment, the chamber unchanged. The tools still in place. The air still cool and heavy. And yet the future suddenly uncertain in a different way. Not the uncertainty of what will be done to you, but of whether you might, against all expectation, step back into daylight. Another gently modern comparison drifts through your mind. It's like waiting for your name to be called in a very serious office. And instead of being sent to the back room, you're told, actually, you're free to go, and no one explains why. Even in these rare cases, the system leaves its mark. A bribe paid is a debt owed. A favor granted creates an obligation. An escape achieved does not erase the memory of how close the body came to the rack. The rope, the chair, survival carries its own quiet weight. As you stand in the imagined stillness, you sense how uneven the landscape of justice could be. For most, the chamber meant procedure, pressure, and endurance. For a few, it meant negotiation, influence, or a narrow path out that others never saw. And you realize that in a medieval torture chamber, the greatest uncertainty was not only what would happen next, but who you were, in the eyes of the world beyond the walls, because that, sometimes, could matter as much as any answer you might give inside. As the possibility of influence and escape fades back into rarity, your attention returns to what the chamber does most consistently and most effectively. It works on the mind long before it overwhelms the body. You realize that the true center of gravity in this room is not any single device, but the space between events, the waiting, the not knowing, the stretch of time in which nothing happens and yet everything feels imminent. Anticipation becomes its own instrument. A well-known historical reality is that medieval interrogations often relied on prolonged uncertainty. A suspect might be kept in custody for days or weeks before any physical questioning began. Hearing rumors of what awaited them, catching glimpses of tools being carried past, sensing the routines of the guards. By the time they entered the chamber itself, much of the psychological work had already been done. The body arrived tense, the mind exhausted from imagining outcomes over and over. You picture sitting alone in a cell, counting footsteps in the corridor, trying to interpret their rhythm. Are they coming for you? Or just passing by? Each pause in sound feels loaded. Each creak of a hinge suggests a decision being made somewhere out of sight. The imagination fills the silence with rehearsals. What you will say, what you will refuse, how you will endure, and then it rehearses how that endurance might fail. A lesser-known detail from prison records is that some officials deliberately varied routines, changing the time of questioning, altering the order of procedures to keep prisoners from predicting what would happen next. Regularity can be endured. Uncertainty is harder. When the mind cannot form a stable pattern, it stays on alert, burning energy, growing restless, becoming more suggestible. You feel how this would erode resolve. The body can brace itself for a known strain. The mind can prepare for a scheduled ordeal. But when the moment is always, soon, and never clearly defined, tension never fully releases. It accumulates, layer by layer, until even small stimuli, a raised voice, the movement of a guard, the scrape of metal, can feel overwhelming. A famous historical context for this kind of psychological pressure appears in accounts of prolonged inquisitorial detention, where suspects were kept in isolation with minimal information about the progress of their case. They were left to wonder whether their silence was helping or harming them, whether the next day would bring questioning, punishment, or release. The chamber itself became only one point in a much longer landscape of waiting. A softly ironic thought passes through you. It's like being stuck on hold with a very serious customer service line. Except the music is replaced by your own heartbeat and the stakes are infinitely higher. Historians still debate how consciously such techniques of uncertainty were employed as strategy and how much they emerged naturally from slow legal processes. Some manuals hint at deliberate pacing, at the value of letting anxiety build before applying direct pressure. Other sources suggest that delays were often bureaucratic rather than tactical. Yet regardless of intention, the effect on those waiting was much the same. You imagine being brought into the chamber after such a period of suspense. The familiar objects, the rack, the rope, the chair, the basin, the brazier, would not be new. You would have pictured them many times already. Perhaps based on rumors, perhaps on fleeting glimpses. Seeing them in reality would not replace imagination so much as confirm it, giving physical shape to fears that had already taken root. Another gently modern comparison surfaces. It's like finally opening a long-anticipated exam paper after weeks of anxiety and discovering that the questions are exactly the ones you've been dreading. But now they are in ink. And time has started. The psychological breaking point does not always come with a scream or a collapse. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the form of a decision, to stop resisting, to start cooperating, to offer whatever seems most likely to bring clarity or relief. The mind, tired of holding tension without resolution, seeks an end to the waiting, even if that end comes at a cost. You sense how the chamber, in its stillness, supports this process. The stone does not change. The light does not vary much. The tools remain in place. The environment offers no distraction, no novelty, no comfort. It is a closed system in which thoughts echo back on themselves, growing louder with each pass. Survival here would therefore depend not only on physical strength, but on the ability to live with unanswered questions, with suspended outcomes, with the slow drip of time that turns anticipation into its own form of pressure. It would mean holding onto a sense of self while the room quietly, patiently encourages you to trade that self for certainty. And in that realization, you understand that one of the most powerful forces in a medieval torture chamber was not pain, but the promise of pain, hovering, undefined, always possible, and always just far enough away to let the imagination do much of the work on its own. After so much tension, anticipation, and carefully managed fear, you begin to sense a subtle shift in the long arc of history. Like a change in weather that doesn't announce itself with thunder but with a gradual softening of the air. The chamber, for all its weight, does not remain the unquestioned center of justice forever. Voices begin to rise, quietly at first, asking whether the methods used here truly lead to truth, or merely to words shaped by endurance. A well-known historical reality is that by the late medieval and early modern period, especially from the 16th century onward, scholars, jurists, and some churchmen started to criticize the use of torture. They questioned its reliability, pointing out that pain could make the innocent confess and the guilty say whatever seemed necessary to stop the ordeal. This growing skepticism did not end the practice overnight, but it planted doubts in the very legal and moral frameworks that had once supported it. You imagine a scholar in a candlelit study, far from this cold stone room, reading trial records and noticing patterns, confessions that contradict themselves, details that grow more elaborate under pressure, retractions made later, when the body is no longer under immediate threat. The ink on the page begins to tell a story that the tools in the chamber never could. That suffering and certainty do not always travel together. A lesser-known detail is that some early critics of torture did not argue primarily from compassion, but from logic. They treated the problem almost like a mathematical one. If pain forces a person to choose between truth and relief is the stronger, more immediate need, then the outcome will be biased toward whatever produces that relief. In modern terms, they were questioning the data quality of confessions. It's the medieval version of saying, your sample size is emotionally compromised. A famous historical context for this changing attitude can be found in the gradual legal reforms of the 17th and 18th centuries in parts of Europe. When torture began to be restricted or abolished in several states, thinkers influenced by new ideas about reason, evidence, and human dignity argued that justice should rely more on material proof and consistent testimony than on what could be extracted in rooms like this. The chamber, once central, slowly became controversial. You feel how this would alter the atmosphere. Even here, the same stone, the same tools, but a growing sense that their authority is no longer absolute. The interrogator's confidence is still there, but now it exists alongside murmurs of doubt from courts, universities, and councils. The idea that truth might survive better in daylight than in torchlight begins to circulate. A small, gently ironic thought floats by. It's like realizing your old, very strict teacher is about to be replaced by someone who believes in open-book exams. Historians still debate how much these reforms were driven by genuine moral awakening and how much by practical concerns, such as the inefficiency of endless interrogations, the political embarrassment of wrongful convictions, or the desire of emerging states to present themselves as more rational and orderly. As with so many changes, idealism and pragmatism likely walked side by side. You also learn that the decline of torture was uneven. Some regions abandoned it earlier, others much later. In some places, it retreated from everyday use but lingered in extraordinary cases. The chamber did not vanish, it faded, becoming less central, more controversial, and eventually, in many legal systems, unacceptable. Another light, modern comparison drifts through your mind. It's like an outdated piece of technology that everyone once relied on, then slowly realized was causing more problems than it solved. Very impressive for its time. The future will say, but maybe not our best idea. The tools remain in the room, silent and unchanged, but their meaning begins to shift. They are no longer simply instruments of procedure. They're becoming symbols of an older way of thinking. One that is being questioned, re-examined, and, in some places, set aside. You stand in the quiet and sense that the chamber is, in a way, waiting for history to make up its mind about it. Once, it was a place of confidence, where law, faith, and power agreed on the necessity of pressure. Now, slowly, it is becoming a place of doubt, a reminder that certainty achieved through fear may not be certainty at all. And in that gradual change, you feel the long, patient movement of ideas, softer than iron, slower than rope, but ultimately strong enough to loosen even the most firmly held assumptions about what this room was for, and whether the truth it claimed to reveal was ever as clear as it seemed. The questions that began as murmurs in scholars' studies slowly find their way into law itself. You can almost feel the chamber's authority thinning, like fog lifting from stone, as new rules start to circle it. Cautious at first, then firmer. The room is still here, the tools still in place, but the world beyond the walls is changing how it thinks about them. A well-known historical reality is that from the 16th through the 18th centuries, various European states began to reform their legal codes, placing stricter limits on when and how torture could be used, and in some cases banning it outright. Courts in places like Prussia, parts of the Habsburg lands, and later revolutionary France introduced requirements for stronger evidence, clearer procedures, and greater judicial oversight. The idea that a confession alone, especially one obtained under pain, was enough to secure a conviction started to lose its grip. You imagine the effect of such reforms on a room like this. The iron chair remains bolted to the floor, but now it is used less often. The rack is still maintained, but its handle gathers a faint layer of dust. The rope and pulley hang as they always have, yet the frequency with which they move decreases. It's not that the chamber disappears, it simply becomes quieter, called upon less readily, like an old policy that remains in the manual but is no longer the first option. A lesser-known detail from the history of these reforms is that some legal codes required not only that torture be limited, but that any confession obtained under it be supported by independent evidence before it could be used in court. This shifted the balance of power away from the moment of questioning and toward the broader process of investigation. The chamber could no longer stand alone as the ultimate arbiter of truth. It had to answer to documents, witnesses, and material proof. A famous historical context for this change is the influence of Enlightenment thinkers who argued that justice should be based on reason and proportion rather than fear. Their writings circulated among lawmakers and judges, slowly reshaping expectations. The law, they insisted, should convince the mind, not break the body. It's a bit like updating the operating system of an entire society, slow, occasionally glitchy, but eventually transformative. You sense how this would alter the rhythm of the room. Interrogators, once trained to escalate pressure, now have to justify each step more carefully. Scribes record not only answers, but the conditions under which they were given. Physicians are called not just to prevent collapse, but to certify that no prohibited methods have been used. The chamber becomes less of a final destination and more of a regulated, contested space. A small, quietly amused thought passes through you. Even medieval bureaucracy eventually decided to add more paperwork. Historians still debate how deeply these reforms penetrated everyday practice and how quickly old habits faded. Did new laws truly protect suspects? Or did they mainly change the language used to describe what happened behind closed doors? The records suggest a mixture. Genuine restraint in some regions, creative reinterpretation in others. Change, as always, arrived unevenly. You imagine a judge reading a new code, pausing at a clause that limits the use of the question. He looks up, perhaps thinking of this very room, of the tools he knows so well. The law is telling him that certainty must now be sought differently. That the path to truth should be straighter, less dark. Another gently modern comparison drifts in. It's like realizing that a once popular shortcut is no longer allowed because it caused too many accidents. And now everyone has to take the longer, safer route. The chamber listens in silence to these developments. If stone can be said to listen, its purpose is being narrowed, its authority circumscribed. It is still part of the system, but no longer its unquestioned heart. Procedures that once flowed naturally toward this room now pause, detour, or stop altogether. You stand there and feel the shift not as a sudden break, but as a slow rebalancing. The tools do not vanish in a dramatic sweep. They remain, patient and unchanged, while the ideas around them evolve. Law begins to lean more heavily on evidence, on consistency, on what can be shown rather than what can be forced. And in that gradual, careful reform, you sense one of history's quiet transformations. The moment when the search for truth starts to move away from the language of pain and toward the language of proof. Leaving the chamber to wait, increasingly in the background, as the world learns, slowly and imperfectly, to ask its questions in other ways. As the law begins to step back from the chamber, another transformation quietly takes place, not in stone or statute, but in memory. The room you've been walking through starts to live a second life. One made of stories, illustrations, and later, popular imagination. And in that life, The boundary between what truly happened and what people later believed happened begins to blur. A well-known historical reality is that many of the most famous, medieval torture devices known today became widely recognized not during the Middle Ages themselves, but centuries later, through museums, engravings, and sensational histories. The Iron Maiden, the spiked chair, elaborate racks with dramatic gears, some were rare, highly localized, or even reconstructed long after the period they were meant to represent. The Middle Ages, in memory, became more theatrical than they often were in practice. You imagine walking into a later exhibition hall, perhaps in the 18th or 19th century, where visitors gaze at darkly lit contraptions labeled as instruments of ancient cruelty. The atmosphere is designed to impress, to shock, to confirm a story of a brutal past now supposedly left behind. The chamber, once a procedural space, becomes a stage set for moral contrast. Look how far we have come. A lesser-known detail is that many devices displayed in early museums of punishment were assembled from fragments, descriptions, and educated guesses. Curators sometimes filled in gaps creatively, producing objects that looked convincingly medieval but reflected more of later fears and fantasies than of everyday judicial practice. The line between documentation and dramatization could be thin, and the audience rarely had the tools to tell the difference. You sense how this would reshape the story. The rack becomes more elaborate. The screws grow larger. The chair sprouts spikes. Fire becomes constant. Water becomes drowning. And every interrogation room begins to resemble a nightmare theater. The quieter elements you've noticed, waiting, silence, legal procedure, psychological pressure, fade into the background, replaced by images of non-stop mechanical horror. A famous historical context for this shift is the 19th-century fascination with the Dark Ages. When writers and artists contrasted a supposedly savage medieval world with their own era's ideas of progress and enlightenment. Torture chambers were depicted as symbols of everything irrational and cruel that modernity believed it had outgrown. The past was simplified into a cautionary tale, and complexity was sacrificed for emotional impact. A small, softly ironic thought drifts through you. Every age seems to need a villainous version of the past to feel better about the present. Historians still debate how much our modern image of medieval torture reflects actual practice and how much it reflects later storytelling traditions that favored the most extreme and visually striking examples. Court records, architectural studies, and procedural manuals suggest a world more regulated, more repetitive, and, in some ways, more mundane than the legends imply. The terror was real, but it was often quieter, slower, and more bound to routine than to spectacle. You consider how this affects the way we imagine survival. In popular stories, endurance is tested by a single, dramatic device, a moment of almost cinematic agony. In reality, survival would more often be tested by time, by isolation, by the long accumulation of fear and fatigue, by the grinding predictability of procedure. The myths favor the instant. The records point to the prolonged. Another lesser-known observation is that some of the most influential early descriptions of torture chambers were written by critics of the practice, who emphasized its horrors to argue against it. Their moral purpose was clear, and their language was vivid. Over time, these descriptions took on a life of their own, repeated and embellished until they shaped a general image that no longer needed the original context to be persuasive. You feel how the chamber you've been exploring now sits between two worlds, the historical one, with its legal forms, its trained officials, its regulated sequences, and the imagined one, filled with shadowy machines and constant screams. Both are powerful, both say something true, but they are not the same story. A gently modern comparison floats into your thoughts. It's like watching a, based on a true story, film and then reading the court transcripts it was inspired by. The film is unforgettable. The transcripts are quieter, more complex, and in their own way, more unsettling. The myths also influence how we judge the people who lived in that time. It becomes easy to see them as uniformly cruel or indifferent, rather than as participants in systems they inherited, questioned, modified, and, eventually, in many places, dismantled. The chamber becomes a symbol of an entire era, when in reality it was one institution among many, shaped by specific legal and cultural choices. You look again, in imagination, at the tools, the rack, the rope, the screws, the chair, the basin, the brazier. They are not props. They are functional objects, designed for repeated use within a set of rules. They do not shout their purpose, they wait. And in that waiting, they tell a story that is less about theatrical cruelty and more about controlled, systematic pressure. As the torchlight flickers across stone, you sense how easily memory can sharpen edges and deepen shadows. The past, once filtered through fear and fascination, can become more monstrous than it already was. Yet if you listen closely, beneath the legends, you can still hear the quieter truths, the measured questions, the long pauses, the careful records, the human calculations. Survival, in that quieter truth, would not look like escaping a single terrifying machine. It would look like enduring a process, a rhythm, a space that worked on the mind as much as on the body. And understanding that difference, between the myth of the chamber and the reality of it, is part of understanding why its legacy has lasted so long. And why its image, once created, has been so hard to lay gently back down into history. The chamber's second life in memory leads you to think about the first time people began to walk back into places like this, not as prisoners, but as observers. The door opens, not for questioning, but for curiosity. The air is the same. The stone is the same. The silence, however, has changed its meaning. A well-known historical reality is that by the 18th and 19th centuries, former prisons and judicial buildings were sometimes opened to the public, either as museums or as guided curiosities. Visitors were shown where trials took place, where sentences were pronounced, and, in some cases, where interrogation had occurred. The chamber that once enforced secrecy now became a space for explanation. Its story retold under lantern light rather than torchlight. You imagine stepping inside with a guide, hearing a calm voice describe what once happened here. The tone is educational, perhaps even polite. Words like procedure, custom, and context replace the urgent, hushed questions that once filled the room. The tools are pointed out, labeled, measured, and discussed. They become objects of study rather than instruments of pressure. A lesser-known detail is that some early museum guides and pamphlets softened or simplified the realities they described, either out of respectability or uncertainty. They might emphasize the existence of devices without explaining how often they were used. Or they might focus on legal theory while passing quickly over the lived experience of those questioned. In this way, the chamber's story could become oddly abstract, detached from sensation. A famous historical context for this shift is the rise of public history in the 19th century. When cities began to preserve and display parts of their past as a way of shaping civic identity. Old courts, towers, and dungeons were restored and presented as reminders of earlier times. The message was often, "This is what we once were," accompanied by an unspoken, "And this is what we are no longer." You feel how that framing would change the atmosphere. The room is no longer a place where your answers determine what happens next. It is a place where your imagination is invited to reconstruct what once happened. The pressure is gone, replaced by reflection, yet the echo of former purpose lingers, like a faint outline on a wall where something heavy once hung. A small, gently ironic thought drifts in. It's like touring an old operating theater and being grateful you're only there for the history lesson, not the surgery. Historians still debate how effective such museum displays are at conveying the psychological weight of spaces like this. Can labels and diagrams communicate what it felt like to wait in silence? To hear a rope shift? To sense heat without flame? Or do they inevitably turn lived fear into something tidy and distant? The stone remains, but the experience has to be imagined. And imagination varies from person to person. You picture a visitor pausing near the iron chair, reading a plaque that lists dates and legal terms. Another stands by the rack, studying its construction. Someone else takes notes, perhaps for a paper or a class. The room, once a place of intense focus on a single body and a single voice, now hosts many quiet observers, each carrying their own questions. A lesser-known observation from early preservation efforts is that some chambers were altered during restoration. Cleaned, repaired, even subtly rearranged to fit narratives of the past. What you see is not always exactly what once was. It is what later generations believed should represent what once was. The chamber becomes both historical site and historical interpretation. Another softly modern comparison surfaces. It's like looking at a black and white photograph that has been carefully colorized. The outlines are real, but the tones are choices. As you stand, in imagination, in this now explanatory space, you sense how survival takes on a different meaning. The people who once entered here hoped simply to leave. The people who enter now hope to understand. The stakes are no longer immediate, but the questions remain heavy. How did systems of law and belief justify such methods? How did individuals endure them? And how did societies eventually decide to move on? The chamber, stripped of its role as an active participant in justice, becomes a witness. It holds the memory of procedure, of waiting, of fear, and of change. It no longer asks questions. It invites them. And in that quiet invitation, you realize that the story of this room is not only about what it once did, but about how later generations choose to remember it, whether as a symbol of cruelty, a lesson in law, a warning, or all of these at once, layered like the stone itself, each era leaving its mark, and then stepping back, letting the next voice take its turn in the still, listening air, as the chamber settles into its role as a place of memory rather than action. Your thoughts drift to the people who once left it and had to return to ordinary life, carrying what the stone could not erase. Survival did not always mean freedom in the clean, uncomplicated sense. It often meant a long, quiet aftermath. A well-known historical reality is that individuals who had been questioned under torture or the threat of it frequently returned to their communities changed. Even when no lasting physical injury was recorded, the experience could alter how they slept, how they spoke, how they trusted. Medieval sources do not use modern language for trauma, but they do describe lingering fear, sudden silences, and a tendency to avoid places or people associated with authority. The body might leave the chamber, the memory did not always follow. You imagine walking back into daylight after a period in this room. The sky seems too wide. Ordinary sounds, voices, carts, church bells, feel strangely loud after so much controlled quiet. The world has continued, indifferent, while your sense of time has been stretched and compressed in unfamiliar ways. A few steps on a sunlit street can feel more unreal than any shadowed corner underground. A lesser-known detail from some post-trial records is that former prisoners sometimes struggled to reintegrate socially. Even when officially cleared or released, neighbors might look at them differently, unsure whether to see them as victims, as suspects, or as people who knew too much. In small communities, the knowledge that someone had been put to the question could cling like a faint echo, shaping reputation long after the case itself had faded. You sense how complicated relief would be. Gratitude for survival might mix with unease, with a lingering alertness that never fully relaxes. The mind, having learned to listen for every change in sound and every shift in tone, might continue to do so. Even in safe places, silence might no longer feel restful. It might feel like the pause before something begins. A famous historical context that hints at this aftermath appears in memoirs and letters from later periods, where individuals who had endured harsh interrogation describe difficulty returning to routine, to conversation, to trust in institutions. While the language and concepts differ from medieval accounts, the pattern is recognizable. The experience leaves an imprint that does not vanish simply because the door has closed. A small, gently modern comparison floats by. It's like leaving a very loud concert and noticing that your ears keep ringing long after the music has stopped. Historians still debate how often medieval society recognized these lingering effects and how often it simply expected people to resume their roles without comment. The records focus on verdicts, sentences, and procedures, not on sleepless nights or sudden silences. Yet between the lines, in brief notes about illness, withdrawal, or melancholy, there are hints that the human cost extended beyond the moment of questioning. You think again of the scribe, the interrogator, the physician, the guards, each with their defined role, each moving on to the next case. For them, the chamber was a workplace, governed by routine. For the person who had stood at its center, it could become a reference point, a before and after marker in life's story. Another softly ironic thought arises. It's like being told, "You're all done now," after an intense exam, and realizing that your mind keeps replaying the questions anyway. The process of rebuilding ordinary rhythms would take time. Trust in voices that once carried authority might be slow to return. Even the sound of footsteps in a corridor, the scrape of metal, or the smell of smoke could trigger a memory, bringing the chamber briefly back into focus. Yet history also shows resilience. People married, worked, traveled, and raised families after surviving interrogation. They found ways to place the experience in the background, to let daily tasks and relationships gradually reclaim the foreground of attention. The mind, like the body, can heal unevenly but persistently. As you stand in the imagined quiet, you realize that survival in a medieval torture chamber was not a single event, but a process. It did not end with the last question or the final note in the record. It continued in the long work of returning to a world that had not stopped. In learning to live with memories that the stone walls had once held in silence. And in that ongoing effort, you sense another, quieter truth, that the chamber's influence extended beyond law and legend, beyond reform and museum display, into the inner lives of those who passed through it and had to find, in their own time and in their own way, a path back to the ordinary light of day. The long arc of memory and recovery leads your thoughts to the final, quieter question: how a place like this eventually loses its immediate power. Not through dramatic destruction, but through neglect, repurposing, and the slow layering of time. A well-known historical reality is that many former interrogation chambers did not remain preserved as they were. Some were converted into storage rooms, offices, wine cellars, or simple basements. Others were sealed, built over, or forgotten as cities expanded and priorities shifted. The stone remained, but its meaning faded, overridden by new uses and new generations who no longer knew what questions had once been asked within these walls. You imagine dust settling where iron once hung, cobwebs stretching across rings in the ceiling, the rack dismantled and its parts reused as ordinary timber, the iron chair carried away and melted down, perhaps reborn as hinges, nails, or farm tools. The physical materials persist, but their story dissolves into everyday utility. A lesser-known detail from urban archaeology is that some medieval torture chambers were rediscovered by accident during renovations or excavations. A blocked doorway opened, a hidden room revealed, hooks in the walls that no longer made sense in the context of a modern cellar. The past, thought to be safely buried, quietly reintroduced itself through stone and iron that refused to disappear completely. You sense how strange such a moment would be. Workers clearing debris, expecting nothing more dramatic than rubble, and instead finding a space shaped for a purpose that has long since lost its legal and moral framework. The room would be empty, but not neutral. Its proportions, its fixtures, its isolation would still speak, even if no one could hear the exact words. A famous historical context for this kind of rediscovery can be found in the restoration of old city centers across Europe, where renovations in the 19th and 20th centuries uncovered forgotten dungeons and courtrooms. These spaces, once central to authority, had become invisible through sheer familiarity, absorbed into the background of urban life until a wall came down and history looked back. A small, quietly thoughtful comparison drifts through your mind. It's like finding an old, Intense letter tucked inside a book you've owned for years. And suddenly realizing the room you're standing in has more layers than you ever suspected. Historians still debate how much is lost when such spaces vanish and how much remains in records. In architecture, and in collective memory, does a chamber need to exist physically to teach its lesson? Or can its story alone carry that weight? The answer seems to be both. Stone preserves atmosphere. Words preserve meaning. Together, they allow the past to be felt as well as understood. You consider how the chamber's silence changes over centuries. Once, it was a silence filled with anticipation, with controlled sound, with the drip of water and the careful movement of tools. Later, it becomes the silence of abandonment, of dust, of air that no longer waits for anything to happen. The same quiet, but emptied of its former urgency. Another gently modern thought surfaces. It's like visiting an old factory that once ran day and night. Now standing still, its machines frozen, and trying to imagine the noise and motion that used to fill the space. In this long quiet, the chamber's authority finally dissolves. It no longer commands fear. It no longer shapes decisions. It becomes an object of curiosity, reflection, and, sometimes, cautionary storytelling. The power it once held over bodies and words shifts into a different kind of power. The power to remind. You realize that this is how many institutions end. Not with a single closing ceremony, but with a gradual slipping out of relevance. The rules change, the practices move elsewhere, the room remains, but the system that animated it is gone. Standing in that imagined stillness, you feel the weight of time doing what no reform alone could fully do. It turns instruments into artifacts, procedures into history, and fear into something that can be examined rather than endured. And you understand that the story of the medieval torture chamber is not only about what it once was, but about how it slowly became something else. A space where the past lingers without commanding the present. Where the echoes of questions and answers have faded into a broader, quieter lesson about power, belief, and the long human effort to learn, change, and leave certain rooms behind. You feel the chamber receding now. Not physically, but in the way a dream loosens its grip as morning approaches. The stone is still cold. The air still quiet. Yet the weight that once pressed so closely against your thoughts begins to soften. Like a shadow thinning at the edges. You take one last slow look around. The rack rests in its place. No longer a promise of strain but a shape in the dark. The rope and pulley hang without motion. As harmless now as any old beam in a forgotten attic. The iron chair waits. But it waits for nothing. The basin's surface is calm, reflecting torchlight that is already beginning to dim. Even the brazier, once a vessel for threat, is only a bowl of settled ash. A well-known historical reality is that every institution, no matter how powerful it once seemed, eventually becomes part of the past rather than the present. The chambers that enforced medieval justice did not vanish in a single moment of reform or decree. They simply lost their urgency. Their doors were opened less often. Their tools were used less frequently. Their role in shaping truth and order slowly passed to other rooms. Other methods. Other ideas. You sense how time changes the meaning of space. A place built for control becomes a place for storage. A room meant for questioning becomes a footnote in a guidebook. Stone that once absorbed whispered answers now absorbs only the faint hum of the city above. The purpose drains away, leaving form behind. A lesser-known detail from architectural history is that many such chambers were never formally decommissioned. They simply slipped out of use. No ceremony, no announcement, just fewer footsteps, longer pauses between visitors, until eventually the silence became permanent. The absence of activity, over years and decades, did what no single decision could do. It turned function into memory. You imagine the last time this room was ever prepared for questioning. A guard lighting torches, an interrogator reviewing notes, a scribe sharpening a quill. None of them would have known it was the last time. History rarely marks its endings clearly. It just moves on, leaving some doors closed and never bothering to reopen them. A small, gentle comparison drifts through your mind. It's like the final day of school before summer. When no one realizes that a certain classroom will never be used again in quite the same way. Historians still debate when, in each region, the practice truly ended in spirit as well as in law. Statutes can change overnight, habits and assumptions take longer. Yet eventually, the questions that once led people here began to be asked elsewhere. In other ways, under different lights, the chamber's authority thinned, then faded, until it became something to look at rather than something to fear. You stand, in imagination, in the center of the room and notice how your own body feels now. Your breathing is steady. Your shoulders are no longer drawn tight. The silence is no longer loaded with anticipation. It is simply quiet, the way a room is quiet when it has finished its work. Another softly modern thought arises. It's like walking through a closed theater after the final performance. The seats empty, the stage dark, and trying to picture the applause that once filled the air. The chamber has told its story, not through screams or sudden motion, but through patience, through repetition, through the slow layering of human intention on stone and iron. And now that story is complete. It does not need to continue, because its meaning has already been carried forward into law, into memory, and into the long, careful effort to build systems that rely less on fear and more on understanding. You turn, in your mind, toward the doorway. The torchlight falls behind you. The shadows soften. The room does not follow. It stays where it is. Part of another time, another way of answering questions. Another chapter that has closed. And as you step away from it, you feel a gentle reassurance. The world you return to is quieter, softer, and far removed from the logic that once animated this space. The stone remains, but its power does not. What endures now is only the lesson, resting lightly, like a final echo that has no need to be loud to be heard. The pace of your thoughts slows. The images blur at the edges, as if a thin mist is drifting in, softening the outlines of walls and tools and shadows. The chamber, once so precise in your imagination, becomes more like a distant memory, a story told in low light, its details gently dissolving into calm. Your breathing finds an easy rhythm, in and out, in and out. The silence that once felt heavy now feels wide and open, like the quiet of a late night when the world has finally settled. The mind, having traveled through stone corridors and long centuries, begins to rest. You no longer need to hold every detail. You can let the rack become just a shape, the rope just a line, The chair just a shadow. The historical weight remains, but it is wrapped now in distance, in understanding, in the soft knowledge that this is no longer a place you must survive, only one you have visited in thought. The torchlight fades to a warm glow, then to a gentle darkness. The echoes fall away, the questions stop. All that is left is a slow, even quiet, the kind that carries you downward into rest. Your thoughts drift, like leaves on still water. The past recedes, the present grows softer, the future, for now, can wait. And in that calm, in that gentle, unhurried stillness, a final whisper settles around you, light and reassuring, like a blanket drawn up just a little higher. End of script. Sweet dreams.